The great hall of Ravenshade Manor stood silent as a tomb, and Duke Cedric Ravenshade, the man who once commanded the respect of half the kingdom's nobility, now stood alone among empty chairs where allies used to sit. 3 weeks ago, his wife removed her wedding ring at a royal banquet and walked away without a word. This morning, the seventh noble house sent formal notice of severed ties. The empire he believed was built on his name was crumbling, and for the first time in his arrogant life, Cedric was beginning to understand what it meant to lose something irreplaceable. But understanding came too late for men like him. What happens when the foundation walks away and the tower realizes it was never strong enough to stand on its own? Stay with me, because this is where the fall truly begins.
Sigh.
The morning light cut through the tall windows of the study like an accusation, illuminating dust particles that danced in air too still, too quiet. Cedric sat behind his mahogany desk, the same desk where his father had signed treaties, where his grandfather had brokered peace between warring provinces, and stared at the letter in his hands. The Pemberton family crest glared up at him in deep crimson wax, already broken by his own trembling fingers an hour ago. House Pemberton hereby formally withdraws all economic and political association with House Ravenshade, effective immediately. 7 sentences. That was all it took to sever a relationship spanning 3 generations. He set the letter down carefully, as if the paper itself might shatter, and reached for the decanter of whiskey on the corner of his desk. 10 in the morning. His hand hovered over the crystal stopper. His father would have called him weak for drinking this early. His grandfather would have backhanded him across the face for even considering it. He poured anyway. The whiskey burned, but not enough to erase the memory of Lord Pemberton's face at that banquet 3 weeks ago. The old man had watched Eveline walk away, watched Cedric stand there doing absolutely nothing, and the disappointment in those ancient eyes had been so profound it felt like a physical weight. Cedric had laughed it off then, told himself Pemberton was a sentimental fool who didn't understand the brutality required to maintain power in a kingdom where weakness was devoured before breakfast. The letter on his desk suggested otherwise. Footsteps echoed into the hallway outside, sharp and purposeful. Cedric didn't look up when his steward, Roland, entered without knocking. That alone should have told him something had shifted. Roland had served House Ravenshade for 23 years and had never entered a room without announcing himself first. "Roland, I'm not receiving visitors today." Cedric kept his voice flat, authoritative, the tone that usually ended conversations before they began. "I'm not here about visitors, Your Grace." Roland's voice carried something Cedric had never heard from the man before, something that sounded almost like pity. "I'm here to inform you that the household staff held a meeting this morning." Cedric's fingers tightened around his glass. "And? 17 members have given notice. They'll be gone by week's end." The whiskey glass hit the desk harder than Cedric intended. 17? Out of how many? 23, Your Grace. The math was simple, brutal. He'd lose 3/4 of his staff within days. Cedric forced himself to breathe slowly, to maintain the mask of control that had served him so well for so many years. Why? Roland hesitated, and in that pause, Cedric saw the truth written across the old steward's weathered face. They were Eveline's people. Every single one of them. "She's been gone for 3 weeks, Cedric said quietly, dangerously. "They serve House Ravenshade, not her." "With respect, Your Grace." Roland's voice remained steady, but his eyes told a different story. "They serve the house that treats them with dignity. Lady Eveline knew every servant's name. She knew their children's names. She attended their weddings, their funerals. She made sure they were paid fairly and on time. She listened when they spoke. The unspoken accusation hung in the air like smoke, and you never did any of that." Cedric stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I built this house into what it is today. I negotiated the trade agreements. I secured the alliances. I made House Ravenshade a name that commanded respect across the entire kingdom." "Did you?" Roland asked, and the question was so simple, so devastating, that Cedric actually took a step back. "Or did Lady Eveline do that while you took credit for it?" "Get out. Your Grace, get out." Roland left without another word, but his footsteps echoed like a death knell long after he disappeared down the corridor. Cedric returned to his chair, to his whiskey, to the suffocating silence that had become his constant companion. He tried to remember the last time the manor had felt this empty, this hollow, and realized with creeping horror that it had always been this way. He'd just never noticed because Evelyn had filled every silence with her presence, her grace, her endless capacity to make people feel valued. He'd mistaken that for weakness, softness, the kind of sentimental foolishness that got noble houses destroyed. Now he sat in a manner that felt more like a mausoleum, surrounded by the ghosts of alliances he'd assumed were his by right. The second letter arrived that afternoon. Cedric watched through the window as a rider in House Blackwell colors approached the manor, delivered a sealed envelope to Roland, and departed without waiting for a response. He knew what it contained before Roland brought it to him, knew it with the sick certainty of a man watching his execution from across a crowded square. House Blackwell regrets to inform Duke Ravenshade that our trade partnership can no longer continue under current circumstances. 8 houses now, 8 families who had smiled at him over dinner, who had clasped his hand and called him friend, who had sworn oaths of mutual support beneath the Ravenshade banner. All gone. Cedric crumpled the letter and hurled it across the room. It bounced off the wall with a pathetic rustling sound and landed near the fireplace, exactly as meaningless as his gesture of rage. He needed to think, needed to understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly, so completely. 3 weeks. That was all it had taken for his entire world to collapse. 3 weeks since he'd made that decision at the royal banquet, the decision that had seemed so logical at the time. The memory came back in fragments, sharp and cutting. Kag. The banquet hall had glittered with 1,000 candles. The cream of the kingdom's nobility gathered to celebrate the king's birthday. Cedric had spent months arranging a meeting with Duke Thornbury, a northern lord whose influence extended across mineral-rich territories that could triple the Ravenshade fortune within 5 years. Thornbury was old money, old values. The kind of man who judged others by the company they kept and the deference they showed to established power structures. He'd made it clear through intermediaries that he preferred to do business with men who understood that wives were ornamental, that power flowed through masculine channels. That sentiment was the enemy of profitable enterprise. So when Thornbury had made that comment, something dismissive about Evelyn's opinion on trade routes, something that questioned why Cedric would let his wife speak on matters of business, Cedric had seen an opportunity. He'd laughed, loud enough for half the room to hear. He'd put his hand on Thornbury's shoulder like they were old friends sharing a private joke, and he'd said the words that had seemed so clever in the moment, so perfectly calculated to win Thornbury's respect. My wife is beautiful and gracious, but she hardly understands the complexities of real negotiation. I married her for her family connections, not her business acumen. Best to leave the actual thinking to those of us who understand how power works. The room had gone quiet. Not the reverent silence of people impressed by his wit, but the shocked silence of people witnessing something obscene. He'd seen Evelyn's face across the banquet hall, seen the precise moment something inside her shattered. She hadn't cried, hadn't screamed, hadn't made a scene that would have given him an excuse to dismiss her reaction as feminine hysteria. She'd simply removed her wedding ring, set it on the table in front of her with a quiet click that somehow carried across the entire hall, and walked out. Cedric had assumed she'd be back by morning. Emotional, yes, but ultimately pragmatic enough to understand that she had nowhere else to go. No power without his name, no future without his protection. He'd been wrong about everything. Eames. The third letter came with the evening post, this time from House Marlowe, Evelyn's own family. Cedric tore it open with hands that shook slightly, though he told himself it was from exhaustion, not fear. To Duke Cedric Ravenshade, after careful consideration and consultation with Lady Evelyn, House Marlowe is formally dissolving all connections with House Ravenshade. The marriage contract is hereby considered void. We expect all property and assets belonging to our daughter to be returned within 30 days, or we will pursue legal recourse. Furthermore, we feel compelled to inform the noble houses of the kingdom that the woman you publicly humiliated has accomplished more for your reputation in 5 years than you have in your entire life. Every alliance you claim to have built was secured by her intelligence, her empathy, and her tireless work to repair the damage your arrogance caused at every turn. You are not the architect of your own success. You are merely the man who happened to be standing nearby when she built an empire with your name on it. We will not forgive what you did to our daughter, neither will history. Lord Edmund Marlowe Cedric read the letter 3 times, each pass making his chest tighter, his breathing shallower. The words felt like daggers, each one placed with surgical precision to cut deepest. He wanted to rage, to destroy something, to prove that Lord Marlowe was wrong, that Evelyn was nothing more than a well-bred woman who'd played her role adequately, but never essentially. Instead, he sat very still and let himself remember. The Pemberton Alliance. He'd botched the initial negotiations so badly that Lord Pemberton had nearly walked away entirely. It was Evelyn who'd hosted a private dinner, who'd listened to Pemberton talk about his late wife for 3 hours, who'd somehow known that the old man's anger came from grief, not greed. She'd salvaged the deal while Cedric slept off a hangover in his chambers. The Blackwell trade agreement. Cedric had demanded terms so aggressive that House Blackwell's representative had called him a short-sighted fool to his face. Evelyn had quietly revised the proposal, had found middle ground that benefited both families, had presented it so skillfully that Blackwell thought it was his own idea. The incident with House Garrett, where Cedric had accidentally, drunkenly, insulted the family matriarch during a hunting party. Evelyn had spent 6 months repairing that relationship through carefully orchestrated social visits, thoughtful gifts, and genuine friendship with Lady Garrett's daughter. Every alliance, every trade deal, every delicate political balance. Evelyn, always Evelyn. Cedric stood and walked to the window, looking out over the manicured gardens that Evelyn had redesigned 3 years ago. The rose garden where she'd hosted dozens of informal gatherings that had done more for House Ravenshade's reputation than any of his formal negotiations. The fountain where she'd convinced the king's niece that the Ravenshade family could be trusted with sensitive diplomatic missions. The bench where she used to sit alone sometimes, late at night when she thought no one was watching. He'd seen her there once, through this very window, had wondered briefly what she was thinking, then dismissed it as unimportant and returned to his ledgers. Now he wondered if she'd been planning her escape even then, if she'd been calculating how much more she could endure, how many more humiliations she could weather before the cost became too high. The door opened again. Roland, his face grave. "Your Grace, I've received word from the city. Lady Evelyn has been seen in Blackmir." Cedric turned sharply. "Blackmir? The coastal trade city? What the hell is she doing there?" Roland handed him another letter, this one sealed with unfamiliar wax. According to this, she's been appointed as an advisor to the Blackmir Trade Council. They're quite impressed with her diplomatic skills. Cedric snatched the letter and read it quickly. The words were professionally cordial, but the message was clear. Evelyn had not only survived her departure from House Ravenshade, she was thriving. The council praised her insight, her integrity, her remarkable ability to bridge divides between competing merchant families. "She has brought a level of sophistication and trust to our proceedings that we have sorely needed," the letter read. "We consider ourselves extraordinarily fortunate to have someone of Lady Evelyn's caliber guiding our negotiations." She'd been gone for 3 weeks and had already built more genuine respect than Cedric had accumulated in a decade. He crumpled the letter slowly, methodically. "What else?" Roland hesitated. "The servants who left have all found positions in Blackmir. Lady Evelyn helped them secure employment with families she's now connected to through the Trade Council. Of course she did. Of course she'd made sure they landed safely, that they didn't suffer for choosing her over House Ravenshade. That was exactly the kind of thing Evelyn would do, the kind of gesture that seemed weak until you realized it was the strongest possible move. She'd taken his people, his alliances, his reputation, and she'd done it without firing a single shot, just by being herself, just by treating people like they mattered. "Your Grace," Roland said quietly, "I should tell you, the remaining staff are reconsidering their positions as well." Cedric turned to face his steward, this man who'd served his family for over 2 decades. "And you, Roland? Are you reconsidering?" Roland met his eyes without flinching. "Every day since Lady Evelyn left, I've asked myself why I stayed. I don't have a good answer anymore." The honesty was devastating. Cedric had always assumed loyalty was something you commanded, something you purchased with wages and authority. The idea that it was something you earned, something fragile that required maintenance and care, that had never occurred to him. "What did I do wrong?" The question came out before Cedric could stop it, raw and desperate in a way that made him hate himself. Roland's expression softened slightly, which somehow made everything worse. "You treated your wife like a political asset instead of a person. You treated your allies like transactions instead of relationships. You built a house on foundations of fear and obligation, and now you're surprised when those foundations crumble the moment someone offers people kindness instead. Cedric wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that kindness was a luxury men in his position couldn't afford. But the words died in his throat because he could see his reflection in the window glass behind Roland, could see the Duke who'd inherited power and mistaken it for wisdom, who'd confused compliance with respect, who'd been so certain of his own importance that he'd never bothered to question whether any of it was real.
"How do I fix this?" he asked, and hated how small his voice sounded. Roland shook his head slowly. "I don't think you can, Your Grace. Lady Evelyn spent 5 years building what you destroyed in one evening. Some things, once broken, can't be repaired."
That night, Cedric got drunk. Not the sophisticated drinking of noble banquets, but the desperate, ugly drinking of a man trying to drown thoughts that refused to die. He sat in his study surrounded by ledgers documenting alliances that no longer existed, trade agreements now worth less than the paper they were written on, and letters from families who'd once competed for his attention and now wouldn't cross the street to spit on him. The manor had never felt bigger, never felt more like a prison. Servants who remained gave him wide berths, speaking only when necessary, their eyes full of something between pity and contempt. He'd become a ghost haunting his own home, irrelevant in every room that Evelyn used to make feel alive. He pulled out old correspondence, letters from the early days of his marriage. Found one from Lord Pemberton congratulating him on his wedding, on securing a wife of such remarkable character and intelligence. "Your bride will make you a better man," Pemberton had written, "if you're wise enough to let her." Cedric had assumed it was a polite formality. Now he understood it was a warning. Another letter, this one from his father, written shortly before the old Duke's death. "Evelyn is the best thing to happen to this family in generations. Don't be fool enough to waste her the way I wasted your mother. Power without partnership is just tyranny with better furniture." His father had seen it, had tried to warn him. Cedric had dismissed it as deathbed sentimentality from a man gone soft in his final years. He'd been wrong. Again. Always wrong, but never aware enough to realize it until the consequences arrived like wolves at the door. A knock interrupted his spiral into self-pity. Cedric didn't bother answering, but the door opened anyway. Roland entered carrying another letter, this one sealed with the royal crest. "The king?" Cedric sat up straighter, hope flaring stupidly in his chest. Perhaps the crown was intervening. Perhaps there was still a path back to relevance. Roland's face suggested otherwise. He handed over the letter without a word. Duke Ravenshade, it has come to our attention that recent events have compromised your standing among the nobility. While we do not involve ourselves in private marital disputes, we cannot ignore the broader implications of your conduct. Lady Evelyn Marlowe was a credit to your house and to the kingdom. Her departure, and the manner of it, reflects poorly on your judgment and character. Effective immediately, House Ravenshade is removed from consideration for the Royal Trade Commission appointments. We require advisors who understand the value of trust and mutual respect, qualities you have demonstrated yourself to lack. We hope you will use this time to reflect on the difference between wielding power and earning it. His Majesty, King Edward. The letter slipped from Cedric's fingers and floated to the floor like a falling leaf. The Royal Trade Commission. He'd been campaigning for that appointment for 18 months. It would have secured his family's influence for a generation, would have given him direct access to the king's inner circle, would have made House Ravenshade untouchable. Gone. All of it gone because he'd treated his wife like a disposable commodity in front of the kingdom's most powerful people. "Your Grace," Roland said softly, "there's more." Cedric laughed, a broken sound that had nothing to do with humor. "Of course there is. Why stop now? 3 more houses sent word this evening. They're severing ties. That brings the total to 11. 11 noble families. Nearly half of the major houses that had formed the core of Ravenshade influence. Cedric tried to calculate how much that represented in lost trade revenue, in dissolved partnerships, in shattered political capital. The numbers made him feel sick. "How many are left?" he asked. 4 houses maintain active relationships, Roland said carefully. "But I've heard rumors that 2 of those are reconsidering. So in 3 weeks, I've lost everything my family spent 3 generations building." Cedric looked up at Roland, really looked at him for perhaps the first time in years. Because I was cruel to my wife at a dinner party. Because you were cruel to the person who held everything together, Roland corrected quietly. There's a difference. Cedric wanted to argue, to find some way to shift blame, to identify external forces responsible for his downfall. But he was drunk enough and broken enough to finally see the truth. This was entirely his fault, every bit of it. He'd built a house of cards on someone else's foundation and convinced himself he was an architect. Where is she now? He asked. Evelyn. Do we know? Roland hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. According to my sources, she's hosting a diplomatic reception in Blackmir tomorrow evening. Representatives from 9 noble houses will be in attendance, including some who've cut ties with you. 9 houses. Evelyn had been in Blackmir for less than a month and was already coordinating diplomatic events that drew more influential attendance than Cedric could manage after years of trying. Who's attending? The question came out rough, desperate. The guest list includes houses Pemberton, Blackwell, Marlowe, and Sterling, among others. Roland paused. They're calling her Lady Evelyn now. Not Duchess, just Lady Evelyn. And from what I hear, people speak her name with more respect than they ever showed your title. Something inside Cedric's chest cracked. Not his heart. That would require a capacity for love he wasn't sure he possessed. But something deeper, more fundamental, his sense of self, perhaps. His understanding of who he was in the world and what he was worth. He'd always believed he was essential, that his name, his title, his authority made him indispensable to the functioning of his social sphere. Evelyn was proving that wrong with every breath she took in freedom. I need to see her, Cedric said suddenly, lurching to his feet with the graceless urgency of a drunk man having a revelation. I need to go to Blackmir. I need to explain, Your Grace, I need to make her understand that this was all a mistake. Roland, you know how politics works. Sometimes we make tactical errors. Sometimes we say things we don't mean for strategic advantage. She'll understand once I explain the context. Roland's face did something complicated, moving through pity and frustration before settling on resigned sadness. Will she, Your Grace? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like Lady Evelyn understands everything perfectly. That's why she left. Cedric shook his head violently, whiskey sloshing in his glass. No, she's emotional. Women are emotional, they don't see the bigger picture. Once she calms down, once she realizes that she needs House Ravenshade as much as it needs her, she doesn't need you at all, Roland said, and the words hit like a physical blow. That's what you still don't understand. Lady Evelyn never needed your house, or your name, or your protection. You needed her. Every single day of your marriage, you needed her, and you were too blind to see it. The glass fell from Cedric's hand, shattering against the floor. Amber liquid spread across expensive carpet in a pattern that looked almost like blood. Get out, Cedric whispered. Your Grace, get out! Roland left, pulling the door closed with a quiet click that felt more final than a slam would have. Cedric stood alone in his study, surrounded by broken glass and broken dreams, and finally, let himself feel the full weight of what he'd lost. Not his political influence, though that hurt. Not his reputation, though that stung. He'd lost the only person who'd ever genuinely believed he could be better than he was. The only person who'd seen potential in him and worked tirelessly to help him reach it. The only person who'd loved him not for his title or his wealth or his family name, but for the man she hoped he might become. And he'd repaid that devotion by humiliating her in front of the entire kingdom. The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching Cedric's mood perfectly. He woke on the floor of his study, head pounding, mouth tasting like regret and cheap decisions. The servant who usually brought his morning tea didn't come. Neither did the valet who laid out his clothes or the cook who prepared his breakfast. Cedric eventually made his way to the kitchen and found it empty, the fire cold, the bread from yesterday starting to harden. He ate it anyway, standing alone in a kitchen that had once bustled with staff who genuinely enjoyed working for House Ravenshade because Evelyn made sure they felt valued. Roland appeared in the doorway, looking haggard. I'm sorry to disturb you, Your Grace, but there's someone here to see you. Who? Cedric couldn't imagine who would visit him now. Creditors, perhaps. Or lawyers representing one of the families, severing their connections.
Lord Edmund Marlowe, Roland said quietly. Lady Evelyn's father. Cedric's stomach dropped. Whatever this was, it wouldn't be pleasant. Edmund Marlowe had never particularly liked him, had only agreed to the marriage because Evelyn insisted she could see potential in Cedric that her father couldn't. She'd been wrong. They both knew it now. "Send him in," Cedric said, trying to summon some remnant of ducal authority.
Edmund Marlowe entered the kitchen like a man walking into a morgue, his expression a careful blend of disgust and grim satisfaction. He looked around at the cold fireplace, the stale bread, the obvious absence of staff, and nodded as if this confirmed everything he'd suspected. Duke Ravenshade. The title sounded like an insult in Edmund's mouth. "I've come to discuss the terms of my daughter's departure." Cedric straightened his shoulders, reaching for the mask of nobility he'd worn so long it should have felt natural. "There's nothing to discuss. She's welcome to return whenever she—" "My daughter will never return to this house," Edmund cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade. "And if you're wise, you'll accept that reality before you embarrass yourself further." Cedric felt his face flush. "Lord Marlowe, with all due respect, this is a private matter between husband and wife. And you lost the right to call her your wife when you publicly humiliated her," Edmund snapped. "You lost the right to her name, her support, and her extraordinary patience. What you haven't lost yet is your legal obligation to return her property and honor the dissolution of your marriage contract." "This is absurd," Cedric protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's being dramatic. Once she calms down—" "She is calmer than she's been in 5 years," Edmund said quietly, and that calm certainty was somehow more frightening than his anger had been. "She's finally free of the burden of propping up a mediocre man and pretending he's great. Do you have any idea how exhausting that was for her? How many nights she stayed awake fixing your mistakes, soothing the feelings you hurt, rebuilding the bridges you burned?" "I built this house," Cedric said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "No," Edmund said flatly. "You inherited it. There's a difference. Your grandfather built House Ravenshade through genuine partnerships and mutual respect. Your father maintained it through careful diplomacy and strategic marriages, including his own, which you apparently learned nothing from. And you? You didn't build anything. You just stood in the house my daughter constructed around you and convinced yourself you were the architect. That's not the Pemberton Alliance? Evelyn saved that after you insulted Lord Pemberton's military service. The Blackwell trade agreement? Evelyn revised your disastrous terms into something workable. The royal connections that got you invited to court functions? Evelyn cultivated those relationships through genuine friendship with the Queen's ladies-in-waiting while you were off drinking and gambling with other useless nobles. Edmund stepped closer, his eyes hard. You want to know what you built? Nothing. You built nothing. You just took credit for my daughter's work and somehow convinced yourself you deserved it. Cedric wanted to argue but found he couldn't. Every defense died on his tongue because Edmund was right. Horribly, completely right. What do you want from me? Cedric asked, defeated. Return Evelyn's dowry. Return all property and assets that belong to her family. Sign the dissolution papers without contest. Edmund pulled a sheaf of documents from his coat. And disappear from her life completely. Don't write to her. Don't send intermediaries. Don't show up in Blackmir thinking you can win her back with pretty words and empty promises. And if I refuse? Edmund smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. Then you'll discover exactly how many people in this kingdom care about my daughter's happiness more than your pride. The alliances you're losing now? That's just the beginning. Force this issue, and I'll make sure every noble house from here to the Northern Territories knows exactly what kind of man you are. You're threatening me. I'm promising you. Edmund set the papers on the kitchen table. You have until sunset to sign these. After that, things get much worse for you. He left without another word, and Cedric stared at the dissolution papers with hands that trembled slightly. His signature on these documents would make it official, would announce to the kingdom that his marriage had failed, that House Ravenshade was weaker than ever, that he'd lost the one asset he should have protected above all others. But refusing to sign would trigger a war he had no army to fight. He thought about Evelyn in Blackmir, hosting diplomatic receptions, building new alliances, living a life that had nothing to do with him. Thought about her smile, rare in their marriage, but devastating when it appeared. Thought about the way she'd looked at him in the early days, like she genuinely believed he could be the man she deserved. He'd proven her wrong so thoroughly it was almost impressive. The sun moved across the kitchen floor as Cedric sat motionless, staring at papers that represented the complete dissolution of everything he'd thought he was. Just before sunset, he signed them. Barshig. News of the official separation spread through the kingdom faster than wildfire. Within days, 2 more houses formally severed ties. Within a week, invitations Cedric had been expecting to royal functions were quietly rescinded. Within a month, House Ravenshade existed in name only, a hollow shell of former glory. And through it all, reports from Blackmir painted a picture of Evelyn thriving in ways that made Cedric's chest physically ache. She'd been appointed to the Royal Diplomatic Corps. She was mediating disputes between merchant families. She was being consulted on trade policy by people who'd previously dismissed her as merely decorative. Her name appeared in correspondence and official documents without any reference to her former marriage, as if her time as a duchess had been nothing more than an unfortunate detour on the way to her true purpose. Cedric spent his days wandering empty halls and his nights drinking alone in rooms that echoed with the ghost of her presence. The staff who remained, Roland and 4 others, worked in silence, their loyalty now clearly a matter of duty rather than genuine respect. He tried to remember when he'd started taking Evelyn for granted, but there was no single moment. It had been gradual, insidious. Each time she'd fixed one of his problems, he'd assumed that was simply what wives did. Each time she'd smoothed over a social disaster of his making, he'd convinced himself it was no great feat. Each time she'd built something beautiful and functional, he'd believed it existed because of his name, not her work. She'd been invisible to him while being visible to everyone else. And now that she was gone, he was invisible too, but for very different reasons. The letters stopped coming, not because people had finished severing ties, but because there were no ties left to sever. House Ravenshade had become irrelevant so quickly, it was almost comical. A month ago, Cedric couldn't attend a social function without being mobbed by people seeking his favor. Now he could walk through the capital's streets without a single person acknowledging his presence. He'd become a ghost while still breathing. One morning, 6 weeks after Evelyn's departure, Cedric woke to find Roland packing his belongings. "You're leaving," Cedric said. "Not a question." "Yes, Your Grace." Roland didn't stop folding clothes into his travel bag. "I've accepted a position in Blackmir." Lady Evelyn was kind enough to arrange an introduction. Of course she was. Cedric sat on the edge of his bed, suddenly exhausted by everything. She always was kind, wasn't she? That was the problem. I mistook kindness for weakness. Roland looked at him for a long moment, and Cedric saw something like compassion in the old steward's eyes. "It's not too late to learn the difference, Your Grace." "Yes," Cedric said quietly. "It is." Roland finished packing and headed for the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think Lady Evelyn hoped you would grow into the man she believed you could be. She gave you every chance. But some men are more committed to their own destruction than their own growth." "Which one am I?" Roland smiled sadly. "You'll have plenty of time to figure that out now." He left, and Cedric heard the front door close with a finality that seemed to echo through the entire manor. Now he was truly alone. The house felt enormous and suffocating all at once, every room a reminder of what he'd lost through his own arrogance. He wandered from chamber to chamber like a prisoner in his own home, seeing Evelyn's influence everywhere but finding no trace of her presence. The library where she'd spent mornings reading diplomatic histories, the garden where she'd hosted informal gatherings that had done more for House Ravenshade's reputation than any of his formal negotiations, the solar where she'd written countless letters maintaining connections he didn't even know existed. Every space whispered her name. Every empty corner screamed her absence. That evening, Cedric received one final letter. Not from a noble house severing ties or a creditor demanding payment, but from an old friend, perhaps his only remaining friend, Lord Marcus Ashford. "Cedric, I'm writing to tell you something you probably don't want to hear but desperately need to understand. Evelyn was the best thing that ever happened to you, and you destroyed it through sheer stupidity. I watched you at that banquet. Watched you sacrifice your wife's dignity for a political advantage that never materialized, by the way. Thornbury signed with House Sterling last week. You humiliated her for nothing. But here's what bothers me most. I don't think you even realized how remarkable she was. You saw her elegance, her grace, her ability to navigate complex social situations, and you assumed those were just natural talents that required no effort. You never saw the work behind it, the emotional labor, the constant vigilance required to keep your entire world from collapsing. She was your foundation, and you treated her like decorative furniture. I'm not writing to make you feel worse. God knows you've probably hit rock bottom already. I'm writing because I hope you'll learn something from this disaster. Power without partnership is tyranny. Success without empathy is hollow. And a house built on one person's invisible labor will always collapse when that person finally walks away. Evelyn is thriving in Blackmir. I attended one of her diplomatic receptions last week, and I've never seen her so genuinely happy. She laughs now, did you know that? Really laughs. Not the polite social laughter she used to offer at your terrible jokes. She's become exactly who she was always meant to be. And you? You're exactly who you always were, just without anyone to hide it anymore. I hope that haunts you. Marcus. Cedric read the letter until the words blurred together, until he'd memorized every cutting phrase, until the truth of it sank into his bones like poison. He was being haunted by memories of a woman he'd never truly seen, by the ghost of a life he'd taken for granted, by the reality that he'd been given something precious and rare and had casually discarded it for the illusion of power. The worst part was knowing that Evelyn was better off without him, that everything Edmund and Marcus and Roland had said was absolutely true. She'd spent 5 years trying to help him become someone worth standing beside, and he'd repaid her by proving he was exactly as mediocre as she'd feared. Cedric stood and walked to the window, looking out over gardens that were already starting to look wild, untended. In a few months, they'd be overgrown. In a year, unrecognizable. Everything Evelyn had built would return to chaos without her constant care, just like him. He thought about going to Blackmir, about throwing himself at her feet and begging forgiveness. But he knew what would happen. She'd be gracious, because that's who she was, but her eyes would be dead when she looked at him. She'd already mourned their marriage, already buried the woman she'd been as his wife, already risen from those ashes into something stronger and freer. There was no room in her new life for his regret. So Cedric did the only thing left to do. He stood in his empty house and finally truly understood what he'd lost. Not just politically, not just socially, but fundamentally at the level of his soul. He'd lost the chance to be loved by someone extraordinary. He'd lost the opportunity to grow into someone worthy of that love. He'd lost everything that mattered while convincing himself he was gaining power. And the kingdom was watching him realize it, one devastating moment at a time. Somewhere in Blackmir, Evelyn was hosting another reception, building another alliance, making another powerful person feel genuinely seen and valued. She was rewriting her story without him, proving that she'd never needed the Ravenshade name to be magnificent. She just needed to escape it. And Cedric? Cedric was learning that some falls don't kill you. They just leave you alive enough to understand exactly how far you've fallen. The morning Cedric decided to go to Blackmir, the sky hung low and gray like a bruise that refused to heal. He stood in front of the mirror in his dressing room, a room that still smelled faintly of Evelyn's perfume despite 2 months of her absence, and tried to recognize the man staring back at him. Thinner, older, eyes carrying the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. He'd stopped shaving regularly, stopped caring about the crisp perfection of his appearance that had once seemed so essential to his identity. What was the point? There were no banquets to attend, no alliances to impress, no wife to unconsciously compete with for the admiration of strangers. The house had 4 staff members left. 4 people in a manner designed to require 20. The silence had weight now, a physical presence that pressed against his skull every waking moment. Cedric pulled on his traveling coat, the expensive one Evelyn had commissioned for his birthday 2 years ago, back when she still bothered with gestures like that, and descended the stairs with the careful steps of a man walking through a graveyard. He found Thomas, the stable boy who'd somehow remained loyal through sheer inertia, preparing a horse in the courtyard. "Blackmir," Cedric said. "How long is the ride?" Thomas looked up, his young face carefully neutral. 2 days if you push hard, Your Grace. 3 if you want the horse to survive." 2 days, then. Thomas nodded and continued working the saddle straps. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but what's in Blackmir?" Cedric almost laughed at the question. "Everything I threw away," he wanted to say. Instead, he settled for business that can't wait. The lie tasted familiar. He'd been lying to himself for so long it had become a native language. He rode out before dawn, before he could talk himself out of this monumentally stupid idea. The rational part of his brain screamed that this was desperation masquerading as strategy, that Evelyn had made her position clear, that showing up uninvited would only confirm every terrible thing people now believed about him. But desperation had a logic all its own, and Cedric was fluent in its language now. The road to Blackmir cut through territories that had once welcomed him with open gates and genuine smiles. Now he kept his hood up, his family crest hidden, moving like a criminal through lands where his name had become synonymous with cautionary tales about arrogance and its consequences. He stopped at an inn the first night, a small establishment that didn't cater to nobility. The innkeeper, a weathered woman with sharp eyes, took his coin without recognition or deference. "You look like hell," she observed while pouring him weak beer. "Long ride," Cedric muttered. She studied him with the kind of assessment people developed when survival depended on reading strangers correctly. Running from something or toward something? Cedric drank half the beer before answering. "I'm not sure there's a difference anymore." The woman nodded like this made perfect sense. "Well, whatever it is, I hope it's worth looking that haunted over." He spent the night in a room barely larger than a closet, staring at ceiling beams and trying to construct speeches that might convince Evelyn to listen. Everything sounded hollow in his head. Every explanation revealed itself as an excuse. Every plea for understanding collapsed under the weight of what he'd actually done. "My wife is beautiful and gracious, but she hardly understands the complexities of real negotiation." His own words played on repeat, a torture device of his own construction. He thought he sounded clever in that moment. Worldly. The kind of man who understood that sentiment was weakness and power required sacrifice. Instead, he'd sounded exactly like what he was, a mediocre man threatened by his wife's competence. The second day of riding brought him through fishing villages where Evelyn's name appeared in casual conversation. He heard it while buying bread from a street vendor, while watering his horse near a public well, while passing groups of merchants discussing trade routes. "Lady Evelyn sorted out that mess with the fishing rights," one merchant was saying. "Did it in 3 days when the council had been arguing for 3 months. She's got a way of making people feel heard," another agreed. "Novel concept for nobility." They laughed, but it wasn't cruel. Just honest observation from people who'd spent lifetimes being ignored by those with power. Cedric kept riding, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the reins hard enough to hurt. Blackmir appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent toward the ocean. The city sprawled across coastal cliffs, all white stone buildings and red tile roofs, fishing boats dotting the harbor like scattered thoughts. It looked prosperous, alive, nothing like the slowly dying estate Cedric had left behind. He found lodging at a respectable inn near the merchant quarter, paid extra for discretion, and spent an hour trying to make himself presentable. The mirror offered little encouragement. He still looked like a man who'd been hollowed out and poorly reassembled. The innkeeper, a jovial man with a spectacular mustache, proved chatty when Cedric inquired about local notable residents. "Oh, you must mean Lady Evelyn," the man said immediately. "She's become quite the figure here. Stays at the Meridian House. That's the diplomatic residence near the council building. Brilliant woman. Fixed the harbor tax dispute that's been festering for a decade. Made enemies into partners in under a month." Cedric forced his expression to remain neutral. "She sounds remarkable." "That she is." The innkeeper leaned closer conspiratorially. "Word is she was married to some duke up north who didn't appreciate what he had. His loss is Blackmir's gain, I'd say." "Indeed," Cedric managed. He spent the evening walking the streets of Blackmir, getting a feel for the city that had embraced his wife so completely. Everywhere he went, he saw evidence of her influence. A community garden behind the council building that fed the poorest districts. New trade agreements posted in the merchant square that bore her elegant signature. Public forums where citizens could voice concerns directly to council representatives, an idea that had Evelyn's fingerprints all over it. She'd been here less than 3 months and had already reshaped the entire city's approach to governance. What had Cedric accomplished in the same time frame? Lost half his noble connections, driven away his staff, and learned to drink alone without passing out before midnight. The comparison was devastating. Night fell, and Cedric found himself standing across from the Meridian House, a beautiful 3-story building of pale stone and arched windows. Lights glowed warmly from within. Through one window on the second floor, he caught a glimpse of Evelyn. She wore a simple blue dress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, instead of pinned up in the severe styles she'd favored at Ravenshade Manor. She was laughing at something someone out of view had said, her face more animated than he'd seen in years.
She looked happy. Actually, genuinely happy. The realization hit Cedric like a physical blow. She'd been miserable with him. Maybe not at first, not in those early months when hope still lived in her eyes. But somewhere along the way, he'd ground that hope into dust, and she'd learned to survive rather than thrive. Now, freed from the weight of his expectations and his casual cruelty, she was blooming. A man joined her in the window's frame, tall, distinguished, maybe 50 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair. He said something that made Eveline laugh again, and she touched his arm with casual familiarity. Cedric felt something ugly twist in his chest. Jealousy, yes, but also something deeper. The sick realization that Eveline had a whole life now that had nothing to do with him, that she'd moved on not just professionally, but personally, that the space he'd occupied in her world had been filled with people who actually valued her. He watched for another moment, then turned away. Coming here had been a mistake. What did he think would happen? That Eveline would see him and suddenly remember some non-existent love? That she'd abandon the life she'd built to return to a dying estate with a man who'd treated her like a political accessory? Cedric walked back to his inn, bought a bottle of whiskey from the bar, and climbed the stairs to his rented room with the grim determination of a man preparing for a very specific kind of battle, the kind fought entirely with yourself. But 3 drinks in, sitting on the edge of a bed that smelled like other people's disappointments, Cedric made a decision. He'd come this far. Cowardice now would make the entire journey pointless. Tomorrow, he'd find a way to speak with Eveline. Not to beg, he had some shreds of dignity left, however tattered, but to understand. To hear from her own mouth what he'd been too blind to see. Maybe she'd refuse. Probably she'd refuse. But at least he'd have tried. The whiskey made sleep possible, if not peaceful. Morning arrived with salt air and the cry of seabirds. Cedric woke with a headache that felt earned, dressed in his least ostentatious clothes, and made his way to the Meridian House. A young clerk at the entrance looked him up and down with professional skepticism. "Do you have an appointment with Lady Eveline?" "No, but I need to speak with her." "It's urgent." "Lady Eveline's schedule is quite full." The clerk consulted a ledger. "She has meetings until this evening. If you'd like to leave your name and the nature of your business..." "Tell her it's Cedric." The clerk's head snapped up, eyes widening slightly. The expression said he knew exactly who Cedric was and exactly why this was a terrible idea. I'll see if she has a moment." He disappeared through a doorway, leaving Cedric standing in a reception area decorated with maps and charts showing trade routes. Eveline's handwriting appeared in notes along the margins of several documents displayed on the walls. Her precise, elegant script that he'd seen on countless letters she'd written on his behalf without ever asking for recognition. The clerk returned quickly, his expression carefully neutral. "Lady Eveline will see you, briefly. Follow me." They climbed stairs to the second floor, moved down a corridor lined with offices where people worked with the focused energy of those who believed their work mattered. The clerk stopped at a door, knocked twice, and opened it. "Duke Ravenshade," he announced, then fled like a man escaping a burning building. Cedric stepped inside and saw Eveline for the first time in 2 months. She stood behind a desk covered with correspondence and maps, wearing a dark green dress that complemented her coloring perfectly. Her hair was styled simply, pulled back in a way that suggested efficiency over ornament. She looked professional, composed, and completely in control of her environment. She also looked at him with the warmth of someone examining a particularly uninteresting insect. "Cedric," she said. Her voice was level, polite, utterly devoid of emotion. "This is unexpected." He'd prepared speeches, practiced apologies, rehearsed explanations that might bridge the canyon between them. All of it evaporated under her cool gaze. "I needed to see you," he said instead, hating how pathetic he sounded. "Why?" She didn't invite him to sit, didn't move from behind her desk. The physical barrier felt intentional, a declaration of boundaries. Because everything fell apart. "Yes, I heard." Eveline's expression didn't change. 11 noble families severed ties. The royal appointment fell through. Your staff abandoned you. She paused. "I also heard you signed the dissolution papers without contest. Thank you for that, at least." "Eveline, I made a mistake." "No." Her voice cut through his attempt at explanation like a blade. "You made a choice.
You chose to humiliate me publicly for political advantage that never materialized. You chose to treat me like a disposable asset. You chose to value Duke Thornberry's approval over your wife's dignity. Those weren't mistakes, Cedric. They were choices that revealed exactly who you are. I was trying to secure our future. Our future? Evelyn's laugh was sharp, brittle. There was no our, Cedric. There was your ambition and my invisible labor supporting it. There was your name on accomplishments I built. There was your comfort purchased with my constant vigilance and emotional exhaustion. She moved around the desk, and Cedric saw something he'd never seen in her before. Anger. Real, clean anger instead of the quiet resignation she'd worn like a second skin during their marriage. "Do you want to know what the worst part was?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. "It wasn't the neglect. It wasn't even the public humiliation. It was the way you genuinely believed you deserved credit for everything I did. You weren't pretending, Cedric. You actually thought you were the architect of our success. I know I took you for granted." Taking someone for granted implies you once held them in proper esteem and gradually forgot. She stepped closer, and Cedric fought the urge to retreat. "You never valued me, Cedric. From the very first day of our marriage, I was a political bridge, a social asset, a tool for your advancement. You told me as much on our wedding night, remember?" Cedric did remember. He'd been drunk, expansive, explaining to his new bride how their union would strengthen both houses, how her family connections would open doors his own influence couldn't. He thought he was being honest, strategic. He'd never noticed the light dying in her eyes. "I was young, stupid." "You're 34 years old," Evelyn said flatly. "At what age were you planning to develop basic human empathy?" The words hit like punches. Cedric felt his face flush, felt the familiar anger rising, the defensive rage that had always been his first response to criticism. But he forced it down, choked on it, because anger had already cost him everything. "What do you want me to say?" he asked quietly. "That you were right about everything? That I'm exactly as mediocre as you always feared? Fine. You were right. I was a terrible husband. I took credit for your work. I failed to see your value until it was too late. Is that what you came here to hear?" "I didn't come here to hear anything from you." She crossed her arms. "You came here, Cedric, uninvited, unannounced, walking into my life like you still have some right to my time and attention. So let me ask you again. Why are you here?" Cedric opened his mouth, closed it. The truth sat heavy in his chest, ugly and humiliating. "Because I don't know how to survive without you." The silence that followed was excruciating. "Then learn," Evelyn said simply. "The same way I learned to survive without you. Through trial and error and the slow, painful work of rebuilding yourself from nothing." "You're thriving," Cedric said. "Not surviving. Thriving." "Yes." Her smile was sharp. "Turns out I'm quite good at my work when I'm not also managing a grown man's ego and cleaning up his diplomatic disasters. I'm not asking you to come back. Good, because I wouldn't." Evelyn moved to the window, looking out over Blackmir's rooftops. "I have a life here, Cedric. A real life. I advise the Trade Council on complex negotiations. I mediate disputes between families who've hated each other for generations. I'm helping restructure the city's charitable programs to actually reach people who need help, instead of just making the wealthy feel philanthropic." She turned back to face him. "I matter here, not because of my family name or my marriage or my ability to smile prettily at important people. I matter because I'm good at what I do. Because I understand that power without empathy is just cruelty with better furniture. That's what your father said. My father's been saying that for 30 years. Evelyn's expression softened slightly, but not toward Cedric, toward the memory of her father. Maybe if you'd listened to anyone besides yourself, you would have heard it. Cedric felt something crack inside him. Not his pride. That was long gone. Something deeper. The last vestiges of the person he'd believed himself to be. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "You can't," Evelyn said gently, and somehow the kindness in her voice was worse than anger would have been. "That's what you need to understand, Cedric. Some things, once broken, can't be repaired. You can't apologize your way out of 5 years of emotional neglect. You can't undo the public humiliation. You can't rebuild trust you never bothered to earn in the first place. So that's it? I just live with this?" "Yes." She met his eyes directly. "You live with the consequences of your choices. The same way I lived with the consequences of marrying a man who saw me as a political asset instead of a person. I did care about you, Cedric said, and was horrified to feel his throat tighten. In my own way. Your way was insufficient. Evelyn's voice remained steady. You cared about me the way you cared about a valuable horse or a well-crafted sword. As something useful, something that enhanced your status. That's not love, Cedric. That's ownership. The word hit like a slap. Ownership. He wanted to deny it, to explain that she was mischaracterizing his feelings, that the truth was more nuanced. But she wasn't wrong. He'd treated Evelyn like property, valuable property, yes, but still something he possessed rather than someone he partnered with. What if I changed? The question came out desperate, pathetic. What if I learned to be better? Evelyn studied him for a long moment. Then why? Why what? Why would you change now? For 5 years I tried to help you become someone better. I modeled partnership, empathy, genuine care for others. I practically wrote you instruction manuals on how to build relationships based on mutual respect instead of fear and obligation. She shook her head slowly. You ignored all of it. So why would you suddenly develop the capacity for growth now? Because I lost everything. Exactly. Evelyn's smile was sad. You'd only change because you're suffering consequences, not because you genuinely understand why your behavior was wrong. That's not growth, Cedric. That's just adaptation for survival. The moment your circumstances improved, you'd revert to exactly who you were before. The accuracy of her assessment was devastating. Cedric knew she was right, could feel the truth of it in his bones. He was here because his empire had collapsed, not because he'd experienced some moral awakening. If House Ravenshade still commanded respect, if nobles still sought his favor, if his wife still fixed his mistakes invisibly, he'd still be the same arrogant fool who'd humiliated her at that banquet. A knock interrupted the heavy silence. The door opened and the silver-haired man from last night entered, carrying documents. He stopped when he saw Cedric, his expression shifting from pleasant to guarded in a heartbeat. Evelyn, is everything all right? His positioning was subtle but protective, placing himself slightly between Evelyn and Cedric. Fine, Marcus. Evelyn's voice warmed noticeably when addressing the other man. This is Duke Ravenshade. He was just leaving. Marcus. The name triggered recognition. Lord Marcus Ashford, Cedric's old friend who'd written that brutal letter. Of course, he'd found his way to Blackmir, to Evelyn's circle of influence. Marcus had always had better judgment than Cedric about what mattered. Marcus, Cedric acknowledged stiffly. Cedric. Marcus's tone was colder than a winter ocean. I'd say it's good to see you, but we both know I'd be lying. The two men measured each other across the office. Marcus stood relaxed, confident, the kind of man who knew exactly where he belonged. Cedric felt every ounce of his own displacement, his irrelevance. I should go, Cedric said finally. He looked at Evelyn one last time, trying to memorize the version of her that existed free from his influence. Thank you for seeing me, Cedric. Her voice stopped him at the door. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. I genuinely do. But you won't find it here. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat, and left. The walk back to his inn felt longer than the 2-day ride to Blackmir. Every step reinforced what he'd just learned. Evelyn was gone. Not just physically absent, but completely, irrevocably removed from his life. The woman he'd married still existed, but she'd been reborn into someone who had no use for him whatsoever. And why should she? What did he offer except regret and belated recognition? Cedric packed his belongings mechanically, paid his bill, and prepared to ride back to the hollow estate that no longer felt like home. But before leaving Blackmir, he made one final stop. The public notice board near the Trade Council building displayed official announcements and upcoming events. Amid the standard postings about tax rates and harbor regulations, Cedric found what he was looking for: Lady Evelyn Marlowe to address Regional Trade Summit. The Regional Trade Council is honored to announce that Lady Evelyn Marlowe has been selected to present our city's new diplomatic framework at the upcoming summit in the capital. Her innovative approaches to conflict resolution and partnership-based negotiation have garnered attention from the royal court itself. Below the announcement, someone had added in careful handwriting, Blackmir's greatest asset isn't our harbor or our merchants, it's Lady Evelyn. Several people had signed their names beneath the sentiment in agreement. Cedric stared at the notice until his vision blurred. This was her legacy now. Not Duchess Ravenshade, political wife to an arrogant duke. Just Lady Evelyn, architect of her own success, beloved by an entire city for reasons that had nothing to do with bloodline or marriage. He'd wanted to possess something remarkable and had destroyed it through the simple act of treating it as possession rather than partnership. The ride back to Ravenshade Manor took 3 days this time. Cedric saw no reason to rush. What awaited him? Empty rooms and emptier futures, the slow decay of a house that had already lost everything that mattered. He arrived home, though it felt obscene to call it that, in the middle of a cold rain. The manor looked smaller somehow, less impressive. Just a building full of expensive furniture and ghosts. Thomas took his horse without comment. The stable boy had perfected the art of not asking questions that might require uncomfortable answers. Inside, Cedric found the latest batch of correspondence waiting on his desk. More polite rejections, more canceled agreements. A letter from his banker explaining, in the gentlest possible terms, that House Ravenshade's financial situation had become precarious. He read them all with the numb detachment of a man examining an autopsy report on his own corpse. The next morning, a courier arrived from the capital. Cedric recognized the royal seal and opened the letter with trembling hands. Duke Ravenshade, we write to inform you that Lady Evelyn Marlowe has been formally appointed as Royal Trade Advisor, a newly created position within the diplomatic corps. Her innovative work in Blackmir has impressed both the council and the crown. In light of this appointment and the professional separation between yourself and Lady Evelyn, we feel it necessary to clarify that any future dealings you might have with the royal court will be evaluated on your own merits, independent of any previous associations. We wish you well in your future endeavors. By order of His Majesty's Council. The message was clear. Evelyn had ascended while Cedric remained in free fall. The crown was making sure everyone understood she'd succeeded despite him, not because of him. He should have felt angry, betrayed, something hot and reactive. Instead, he felt only a hollow ache and the distant recognition that he was witnessing justice, not persecution. Cedric spent the afternoon in Evelyn's old sitting room, surrounded by evidence of her presence. Books she'd read, marked with notes in the margins, cushions she'd embroidered during long winter evenings, a half-finished letter to her sister, abandoned the day she'd left. The ink faded, but still legible. Dear Margot, I think I've finally accepted that hoping for Cedric to change is like waiting for stone to become water. It simply isn't in his nature. I've built everything I can around him, and he still doesn't see the scaffolding, only the edifice with his name on it. I'm so tired, Margot. Tired of being invisible while being indispensable. Tired of fixing problems I didn't create. Tired of loving someone who views love as a weakness to exploit. I think soon I'll have to make a choice. The letter ended there. Whatever choice she'd been contemplating, the banquet had made it for her. Cedric set the letter down carefully, his hands steady despite the storm inside his chest. This was his inheritance now, not the manor or the title or the slowly evaporating wealth. His real inheritance was understanding, too late, too completely, exactly what he'd destroyed. Both say, 6 months after Eveline's departure, House Ravenshade existed in name only. The remaining staff had left gradually, pulled away by better opportunities or simple self-preservation. Creditors circled with increasing boldness. The fields that had once produced profitable crops sat fallow, their tenants having quietly relocated to estates with actual futures. Cedric lived alone in 3 rooms of the vast manor. The rest closed off to conserve heat and pretend the emptiness was a choice rather than inevitability. News from the capital arrived regularly, usually in the form of broadsheets and gossip that painted pictures of Evelyn's continued success. She'd mediated a dispute between 3 northern provinces that had been feuding for a decade. She'd restructured the crown's charitable programs to be actually effective rather than merely ornamental. She'd become the person nobles consulted when they needed genuine wisdom instead of political maneuvering. Her name appeared in royal correspondence more frequently than some princes. And Cedric? Cedric had become a ghost story, a cautionary tale told to young nobles about the dangers of arrogance and the importance of valuing your partners. Don't be like Ravenshade, they said. He had everything and lost it because he couldn't tell the difference between a wife and a servant. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd wanted to build a legacy, to be remembered as a great duke who'd expanded his family's influence. Instead, his legacy was serving as a warning label for others. On a particularly cold evening in late autumn, Cedric received his final visitor. Lord Edmund Marlowe arrived without warning, his carriage pulling up to the manor like an invasion force of one. The old man climbed down with the slow care of someone whose joints ached, but his eyes were sharp as ever. Cedric met him in what had once been the grand receiving room, and was now just a large empty space with furniture covered in dust sheets. "Lord Marlowe," Cedric said. "I wasn't expecting—" "No, you weren't." Edmund looked around the room with undisguised assessment. "Good God, Cedric, you've let the place fall apart completely. There's no one left to maintain it." "Yes, I noticed." Edmund settled into one of the few uncovered chairs, his movements deliberate. "I've come to discuss the final details of the estate's dissolution." "Dissolution?" Cedric felt his stomach drop. "What are you talking about? Did you think this could continue indefinitely?" Edmund pulled documents from his coat. "You're bankrupt, Cedric. The estate is underwater. You've got debts you can't pay and no income to speak of. The only question is whether you handle this with some dignity or whether your creditors drag you through public humiliation." Cedric sat down heavily. "How bad is it?" Edmund spread the papers across a small table. "Bad enough that selling everything you own might cover 70% of what you owe. The rest," he shrugged, "you'll need to negotiate settlements, possibly declare formal insolvency." The words hit like physical blows. Insolvency. Bankruptcy. The complete and total destruction of House Ravenshade, reduced to a legal proceeding. "There's nothing left?" Cedric heard himself ask, though he already knew the answer. "A few personal effects. Some furniture that might fetch decent prices. The title itself, which is worthless without the estate to back it up." Edmund's expression was clinical, the look of a surgeon examining a terminal patient. "You'll survive, Cedric. You won't be comfortable, but you'll survive." "What will I do?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Edmund leaned back, studying Cedric like a specimen. Evelyn rebuilt herself from nothing, found purpose and meaning outside the identity she'd been handed. "Can you do the same?" "I don't know." "Well, you'd better figure it out quickly." Edmund stood, preparing to leave. "The world doesn't care about your title or your family name. It cares about what you contribute." Evelyn understood that. "You never did. Is she—" Cedric couldn't finish the question. Edmund's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "She's remarkable. She's happy. She's everything she was always meant to be. And she never asks about you." The final sentence landed with surgical precision, cutting exactly where Edmund intended. "Good," Cedric managed. "That's good." Edmund nodded slowly, and for just a moment, something like pity crossed his face. "You know what the tragedy is, Cedric? You could have been part of something beautiful. Evelyn would have made you better if you'd let her, would have built something with you instead of for you, but you were too busy protecting your ego to accept partnership." He walked to the door, then paused. "Sign the papers. Settle your debts as best you can, and for God's sake, learn something from this disaster." Then he was gone, leaving Cedric alone with documents that detailed the complete dismantling of everything his family had built over 4 generations. Cedric sat in the failing light of afternoon, the papers scattered before him like accusations, and finally, truly, understood what it meant to lose. Not just wealth or status or social position. He'd lost the possibility of being someone better. He'd lost the chance to build something meaningful with someone extraordinary. He'd lost everything that could have made his life matter beyond the accident of his birth. And Evelyn? Evelyn had won by walking away, by refusing to let his gravity drag her down, by choosing herself over the performance of being his wife. The kingdom would remember her as the woman who rebuilt herself after escaping a suffocating marriage. They'd remember him as the fool who let her go. Cedric signed the papers as the sun set on Ravenshade Manor for what would be one of the last times. The manor would be sold. The title would become an empty honorific attached to a man with no estate, no influence, no purpose. And somewhere in the capital, at a royal function he'd never be invited to again, Evelyn was probably laughing at something genuinely funny, surrounded by people who valued her mind and her heart, and her remarkable ability to see possibility where others saw only problems. She'd become a legend. He'd become a lesson. The next morning, Cedric woke in his mostly empty manner and made a decision. He couldn't fix what he'd broken, couldn't apologize his way back into relevance, couldn't undo years of taking for granted the one person who'd actually believed in him. But he could stop pretending there was a path back to who he'd been before. That man, Duke Cedric Ravenshade, confident in his superiority, certain of his importance, was dead. Killed by consequences and the slow realization that every assumption he'd built his life on was wrong. What remained was something smaller, more frightened, infinitely more honest. A man who'd lost everything and had nowhere left to fall. The letter arrived on a morning when frost covered everything like a layer of accusation. Cedric sat in what had once been his father's study, now the only heated room in the manor, watching his breath form clouds in air that tasted like failure and dust. Thomas brought the letter with unusual hesitation, his young face troubled in a way that made Cedric's stomach tighten before he'd even broken the seal. "This came by special courier, Your Grace. From the capital." The boy's voice cracked slightly on the honorific, as if he wasn't sure Cedric still deserved it. Cedric took the envelope. Heavy paper. Expensive. The kind used for official correspondence from people who wanted you to know they were important. No family crest on the wax, just a generic seal that somehow felt more ominous than identification would have been. He opened it with fingers that had developed a tremor over the past few weeks. Malnutrition, probably. Or stress. Or the simple physical manifestation of a body that knew it was attached to a doomed enterprise. The first lines made his vision narrow to a pinpoint. Duke Ravenshade. By now you've likely realized that your financial situation is beyond repair. What you may not realize is that this outcome was not entirely accidental. Cedric's hands began to shake. He forced himself to keep reading. For the past 18 months, a consortium of noble houses has been systematically undermining your economic foundation. We accelerated trade agreements that excluded Ravenshade interests. We encouraged creditors to call in debts simultaneously. We ensured that every political misstep you made was amplified. Every alliance you damaged remained broken. You might wonder why we would coordinate such an elaborate campaign against a single house. The answer is simple. You were building influence on a foundation of fraud, taking credit for work you didn't do, and we decided the kingdom would be better served by removing you from positions of potential power. But here's what you really need to understand, Cedric. The woman who coordinated this entire operation, the architect of your complete and total destruction, Lady Evelyn Marlowe. The letter fell from Cedric's hands, pages scattering across the floor like scattered thoughts. No, that couldn't be right. Evelyn had left to escape him, to build her own life. She'd walked away seeking freedom, not revenge. The woman he'd seen in Blackmir had been focused on her own success, not on orchestrating his failure. Cedric scrambled to gather the fallen pages, his heart hammering against his ribs, hard enough to hurt. Your former wife approached us 6 months before that fateful banquet. She provided detailed documentation of every alliance you'd mismanaged, every diplomatic disaster she'd quietly fixed, every instance of you taking credit for her work. She made a compelling case that House Ravenshade's influence was built entirely on her invisible labor. She proposed a test. If she withdrew her support, how long would your empire last? We agreed to observe and, where beneficial to our own interests, to accelerate the natural collapse. The banquet humiliation? She knew exactly what you'd do. She'd watched you posture and perform for years. She knew Duke Thornberry's preferences, knew you'd sacrifice her dignity for perceived advantage. She gave you the rope, Cedric, and you hanged yourself exactly as she predicted. Everything that's happened since, the severed alliances, the financial collapse, the social exile, was set in motion long before you opened your mouth that night. You just gave her the public justification she needed. Cedric's breath came in short, sharp gasps. The room tilted sickeningly. This had to be a lie. Some enemy trying to poison what little remained of his peace. Evelyn wasn't capable of this kind of calculated destruction. Except she absolutely was. He'd just never bothered to notice. The letter continued in handwriting that shifted halfway through, Edmund Marlowe's distinctive script. My daughter is the most brilliant strategist I've ever known. You thought she was soft because she was kind. You mistook her patience for weakness. You assumed her smile meant compliance. She spent 5 years documenting every failure, building relationships with every house you'd alienated, positioning herself as the solution to a problem you didn't know existed. By the time you humiliated her publicly, she'd already secured agreements from 14 noble families to support her independence and actively oppose your continued influence. You weren't destroyed by a moment of cruelty, Cedric. You were destroyed by a carefully orchestrated campaign that used your own arrogance as its primary weapon. Evelyn wanted you to know this, not out of spite. She's moved far beyond caring what you think, but because she believes you should understand the full scope of what you lost. You didn't just lose a wife. You lost the only person intelligent enough and patient enough to have actually made you successful. She built your empire. She's the one who tore it down. And she did both with a level of competence you'll never possess. Consider this your education in consequences. Lord Edmund Marlowe. The pages fell again. Cedric made no move to retrieve them. His mind worked frantically, replaying the past year through this new lens. The timing of the alliance collapses, the coordinated nature of the withdrawals, the way certain houses had cut ties with identical language, as if working from the same template. Evelyn's rapid success in Blackmir, not just talent recognized, but a position waiting for her. Relationships already established, a support network that appeared overnight because it had been built carefully, deliberately, over months. She'd been planning her exit for half a year before that banquet. Every smile, every dutiful appearance, every moment of seeming acceptance had been performance while she constructed his gallows board by board. The woman he'd seen in that Blackmir office, surrounded by success and genuine happiness. She hadn't just moved on from him. She'd actively engineered his destruction as the final act of their marriage. Cedric stood abruptly, the chair toppling behind him. He paced the study like a caged animal, his breath coming faster, his hands clenching and unclenching. Rage built in his chest, hot and vicious. How dare she? How dare she manipulate him like this, orchestrate his downfall, then play the victim to the entire kingdom? She'd made him into a villain, a cautionary tale, when she was the one who'd betrayed their marriage with calculated malice. He wanted to destroy something, wanted to ride back to Blackmir and expose her for the manipulative strategist she really was, wanted to burn down everything she'd built the way she'd burned down his life. The fury carried him through 3 circuits of the room before it began to collapse under its own weight. Because even in his rage, even with this new understanding of how completely he'd been played, Cedric couldn't escape one simple truth. Evelyn had only been able to destroy him because there was nothing real holding his empire together. She'd pulled the linchpin and everything collapsed because he'd never actually built anything solid. Just stacked borrowed reputation and stolen credit high enough that the fall would be spectacular. Cedric sank into another chair, the anger draining away and leaving something colder, sharper in its wake. Understanding. Evelyn hadn't betrayed him. She'd simply stopped protecting him from the natural consequences of his own incompetence. Every alliance that fell apart had been fragile from the start, held together only by her constant maintenance. Every creditor who called in debts was responding to financial mismanagement he'd been too arrogant to notice. Every noble who turned away had been waiting for an excuse because they'd never actually respected him, only tolerated him for Evelyn's sake. She hadn't destroyed House Ravenshade. She'd just stopped holding it together. The distinction felt important in a way Cedric couldn't fully articulate. He retrieved the letter pages with shaking hands and read them again, more carefully this time, looking for malice and finding only cold calculation. This wasn't revenge, it was surgery. Evelyn had removed herself from a toxic situation and ensured she'd never be forced back into it by systematically eliminating his power over her. The kingdom thought she was the victim because she was. The fact that she'd also been the architect of his downfall didn't change the fundamental reality. He'd given her every reason to want him destroyed. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression wary. "Your Grace, are you all right? I heard—" "Get out," Cedric said quietly. "But Your Grace—" "Get out!" The boy fled. Cedric heard his footsteps echoing down the corridor, too fast, panicked. Good. Let him run. Let everyone run. There was nothing left here worth staying for anyway. Cedric spent the next 3 hours sitting motionless in the study, the letter pages spread before him like evidence at a trial. His trial. Judged and convicted by the woman he'd spent 5 years diminishing. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the floor, Cedric heard the front door open and close. Footsteps approached with the heavy confidence of someone who'd been expected. Marcus Ashford entered without knocking, his expression carefully neutral. He looked around the decrepit study, the fallen chair, the scattered papers, and nodded as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. "So you got the letter," Marcus said. Not a question. Cedric stared at his former friend. "You knew. You knew the whole time." Marcus settled into a chair uninvited. "I helped, actually. Evelyn needed introductions to certain houses. I provided them. Seemed like the least I could do after watching you waste the best thing that ever happened to you." The casual admission was somehow worse than the letter itself. "You're proud of this." "Damn right I am." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes hard. "You want to know what Evelyn said when she first approached me?" She said, "I've spent 5 years making Cedric look competent. I'd like to spend the next 5 proving I don't need him at all. How could I refuse a request like that? So you all conspired against me. All of you. While smiling to my face and drinking my wine."
"Your wine?" Marcus laughed, sharp and bitter. "Cedric, you really still don't get it. Whose money do you think funded those banquets? Whose connections secured the invitations? Evelyn's dowry paid for half your lifestyle, and her family's influence got you into rooms you had no business being in. You were drinking her wine at parties she organized to support your illusion of importance. I built relationships. You stood in rooms Evelyn arranged and took credit for conversations she orchestrated." Marcus's voice was scalpel sharp. "I watched her do it for years. Watched her set up meetings, coach you through negotiations, then stand silently while you accepted praise for her strategies. It was masterful and heartbreaking in equal measure. If she was so miserable, why didn't she just leave? She tried." Marcus's expression shifted to something almost sad. "She tried to make you see her. Tried to help you become someone worthy of partnership, but you were too busy believing your own mythology to notice. So eventually she stopped trying to fix you and started planning her exit." Cedric's throat felt tight. How long? How long what? How long was she planning this? Marcus considered the question. "Actively? About 8 months. But she'd been documenting your failures for years. Just in case. Evelyn's nothing if not thorough." The image of Evelyn, his quiet, dutiful wife, methodically recording every mistake, every misstep, every moment of cruelty or neglect, was somehow more devastating than the coordinated destruction itself. She'd been building a case against him while he'd been oblivious, confident, secure in his unearned superiority. "Why are you here?" Cedric asked. "Come to gloat?" "No." Marcus pulled an envelope from his coat. "I'm here to deliver Evelyn's final message. She wanted you to understand the full picture before making your next move." "What next move?" Cedric gestured at the ruined study, the empty manor beyond. "There are no moves left, Marcus. She won. Completely. Totally. What more could she possibly want?" "Read it," Marcus said simply, placing the envelope on the desk between them. After Marcus left, Cedric sat staring at the envelope for nearly an hour. Whatever it contained, it would hurt. Evelyn's thorough dismantling of his life had proven she understood exactly where his weak points were and how to exploit them with surgical precision. Finally, as darkness filled the study and the temperature dropped toward freezing, Cedric broke the seal. The handwriting was Evelyn's, elegant and precise as always. "Cedric, by now you know the truth about how your empire fell. I imagine you're feeling betrayed, angry, perhaps even justified in your rage. Let me address that directly. You have no right to feel betrayed. Betrayal requires trust, and you never trusted me with anything that mattered. You trusted my ability to fix your mistakes, certainly. You trusted that I'd maintain appearances. But you never trusted me as a partner, never shared real power, never treated our marriage as anything more than a political arrangement. I didn't betray you. I stopped enabling you. For 5 years I carried weight you didn't even know existed. I managed relationships you thought maintained themselves. I prevented disasters you never knew threatened you. I built the foundation of everything you believed was your natural right. And you never once asked how it all worked. Never wondered why people who should have hated you tolerated your presence. Never questioned why diplomatic disasters somehow resolved themselves overnight. You assumed you were simply that naturally talented, that arrogance made this entire situation possible. I want you to understand something crucial. I didn't plan your destruction out of hatred or spite. I planned it out of necessity. As long as you held power,
As long as our marriage bound me to your reputation, I would never be free to become who I was meant to be. Your gravity would always pull me back into the role of invisible support system. So I removed your gravity. Systematically, carefully, using nothing but the truth about who you actually were once I stopped holding everything together. Every house that cut ties did so because you'd given them reason to distrust you. Every creditor who called debts was responding to your actual financial mismanagement. Every invitation you lost was one you'd never earned in the first place. I didn't create these problems, Cedric. I just stopped fixing them. Now you're facing the reality of what you built on your own. Nothing. I'm not writing to apologize. I'm writing because I want you to understand that this outcome was entirely avoidable. If you'd treated me as a partner instead of an asset, if you'd valued my intelligence instead of just my connections, if you'd shown even basic respect for the work I did on your behalf, none of this would have been necessary. You forced my hand by making it clear I would never matter to you as a person, only as a tool. So I became a very effective tool for my own liberation. I'm told you visited Blackmir. That was foolish and exactly the kind of entitled behavior that made this necessary. Let me be absolutely clear. You are not welcome in my life. Not now, not ever. I have built something real in Blackmir, and I will protect it from you with the same ruthless efficiency I used to dismantle your illusions of power. Do not contact me. Do not attempt to expose my role in your downfall. No one will believe you, and it will only make you look more pathetic. Do not try to rebuild House Ravenshade's influence. There is no foundation left to build on. Your only option now is to accept reality. You were never as important as you believed, and I was never as weak as you assumed. I hope the rest of your life teaches you the humility that our marriage couldn't. Learn to survive on your own merit, Cedric. It's what I had to do. Evelyn Cedric read the letter 3 times, each pass stripping away another layer of defensive anger until only raw truth remained. She was right. About everything. He'd treated her like an asset, had assumed her competence was just natural wifely duty, had never once asked how she managed the impossible task of making him appear successful, had taken and taken and taken until there was nothing left of her but resentment and exhausted determination to escape. And when she'd finally left, he'd had the arrogance to show up in Blackmir expecting what? Forgiveness? A chance to explain? As if explanations could undo 5 years of systematic neglect and casual cruelty. Evelyn hadn't just outmaneuvered him. She'd understood him so completely that she'd predicted his every response, prepared for his every move, neutralized every potential threat he might pose to her new life. She treated the dismantling of his empire like a complex negotiation, and he'd never even known he was at the table. The full weight of it crashed over Cedric like a wave. He wasn't the protagonist of this story. He was the obstacle Evelyn had overcome, the problem she'd solved, the cautionary tale she'd created to ensure no other woman would be trapped the way she'd been trapped. His entire life, his entire identity, had been reduced to a lesson about the dangers of taking competent women for granted. 3 days after receiving Evelyn's letter, Cedric received an unexpected visitor. The woman who entered his study was perhaps 40, dressed in expensive but understated clothes, her bearing suggesting someone accustomed to authority. She introduced herself as Lady Helena Vance, a name Cedric recognized from court circles, though they'd never been formally introduced. Duke Ravenshade, she said, settling into a chair without invitation. I've come to make you an offer. Cedric studied her warily. He'd learned to distrust unexpected generosity. What kind of offer? The kind that might give you a chance to salvage something from the wreckage of your life. Helena's smile was sharp. I represent a coalition of minor noble houses who are interested in what happened to you. Why would anyone be interested in my failures? Because your failures expose something we've suspected for years. That a significant percentage of noble influence is built on the invisible labor of wives and daughters who never receive credit for their work. Helena leaned forward. Lady Evelyn's orchestrated withdrawal and your subsequent collapse proves our theory rather dramatically. Cedric felt his face heat. So I'm what? A case study? You're an opportunity. Helena pulled documents from her bag. We want to offer you a position. Nothing glamorous. You'd be advising minor houses on how to avoid the mistakes you made, how to recognize when they're taking their partners for granted, how to build genuine partnerships instead of exploitative arrangements. Cedric stared at her. You want me to teach people not to be like me? Exactly. Your complete and total failure makes you uniquely qualified to identify the warning signs. Helena's expression was clinical. You'd essentially be a living cautionary tale, but one with practical application. That's humiliating. Yes, Helena agreed calmly, but it's also survival. You're bankrupt, your estate is being liquidated, and your title is worth less than the paper it's written on. This position would provide modest income and housing in exchange for your honest assessment of your own failures. Why would I agree to this? Because the alternative is disappearing into irrelevance and poverty. Helena gathered her documents. We're not offering you redemption, Cedric. We're offering you a purpose. Something to do with your remaining years besides drink yourself to death in an empty manner. The accuracy stung. And if I refuse? Then we move on to other candidates, and you continue your current trajectory toward complete obscurity. Helena stood. I need an answer within 3 days. After she left, Cedric sat alone with her offer. The proposition was degrading, turning himself into an object lesson, admitting his failures repeatedly to strangers, building a new identity entirely around his incompetence and arrogance. But it was also the only option that didn't end with him dying alone and forgotten in a collapsing building. He thought about Eveline's letter, about her insistence that he learn to survive on his own merit. This wasn't exactly merit. This was survival through public humiliation. But maybe that was what he deserved. Maybe his merit, such as it was, lay in being honest about how thoroughly he'd failed. The thought made him sick, but he couldn't deny its logic. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one from an unexpected source, the royal court. Duke Ravenshade. It has come to our attention that Lady Evelyn Marlowe coordinated your political and financial collapse over an extended period. While we do not typically intervene in private disputes, the systematic nature of this campaign raises certain concerns about appropriate conduct among the nobility. Cedric's heart jumped. Were they going to punish Evelyn? Restrict her position? The thought gave him a savage satisfaction that immediately made him hate himself. However, upon thorough investigation, we have determined that Lady Eveline's actions, while calculated, were entirely within legal and ethical bounds. She withdrew her own labor and support, which was her right. She documented your failures accurately. She coordinated with other houses through legitimate political channels. She did nothing except stop protecting you from yourself. The court wishes to make clear that we view her actions as a reasonable response to systematic mistreatment. Your collapse was not caused by sabotage, but by the removal of artificial support. We are writing to inform you that any attempt to damage Lady Evelyn's reputation or position will be viewed as harassment and dealt with accordingly. She has our full support and protection. Additionally, we have been made aware of Lady Vance's offer of employment. We encourage you to accept it. The kingdom benefits when failed leaders are willing to teach others from their mistakes. Consider this your only warning. Lady Evelyn Marlowe is under royal protection. Stay away from her. By order of the crown. Cedric let the letter fall to his desk. Even the crown had taken Eveline's side. Of course they had. She'd probably cultivated those relationships too, planting seeds years ago that were now blooming into comprehensive protection. She'd thought of everything. Neutralized every possible avenue of retaliation. Built walls around her new life so thorough that Cedric couldn't touch her, even if he wanted to. And the most devastating part? She'd done it all using skills she'd developed while managing his impossible ego and endless incompetence. He'd trained the architect of his own destruction without ever realizing what she was capable of. On the third day, Cedric signed Lady Vance's contract. The position came with a small stipend, a modest apartment in a minor city, and the explicit understanding that his role was to serve as a warning to others. He would meet with young nobles, analyze their relationships, identify patterns of taking partners for granted, and help them course correct before destroying everything. He would be Duke Cedric Ravenshade, professional failure. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his entire life trying to build a legacy of power and influence. Instead, his legacy would be serving as an example of how not to live. But as he packed the few personal possessions that hadn't been sold to pay debts, Cedric found himself thinking about what Eveline had written. Learn to survive on your own merit. This was merit of a sort. The merit of honestly confronting his failures. The merit of using his disaster to help others avoid similar fates. Not the legacy he'd wanted, but possibly the one he deserved. The manor sold quickly to a merchant family eager for the appearance of nobility. They walked through the empty rooms with excitement, planning renovations and new beginnings, completely unaware of the ghosts that haunted every corridor. Cedric watched from the courtyard as they measured windows and discussed paint colors. They were erasing him already, painting over his existence with their aspirations. Thomas appeared at his elbow, the boy's bags packed and ready. "I got a position in the new household, Your Grace. They're keeping me on." "Good," Cedric said quietly. "That's good. You deserve stability." "Will you be all right?" Thomas asked, and the genuine concern in his voice was almost unbearable. "I don't know," Cedric admitted, "but I'm going to try to be better than I was." The boy nodded solemnly, then surprised Cedric by extending his hand. "Good luck, Your Grace. I hope you find what you're looking for." Cedric shook the offered hand, feeling the calluses of honest work against his own soft palms. "I hope so too." He left Ravenshade Manor on a cold morning in early winter, riding away from everything his family had built, everything he'd inherited and destroyed. The building grew smaller in his vision until it disappeared entirely, and Cedric felt both grief and strange relief. That life was over. The question now was whether he could build something real from the ruins. Oats. The apartment Lady Vance provided was small, clean, functional. 2 rooms above a bookshop in a city where no one recognized his name or cared about his title. Cedric moved in with a single trunk of belongings and the crushing weight of starting over at 34 with nothing but his failures to recommend him. His first assignment came within a week. Lord Peter Ashton, a young noble recently married, had requested consultation. Cedric met him in a neutral office, watching the young man fidget nervously. "My wife says I don't listen to her," Peter began. "Says I dismiss her ideas. But I'm just trying to maintain proper authority in our household. Women don't understand the complexities of—" Cedric held up a hand. "Stop! Right there. Stop!" Peter blinked, confused. "How many times has your wife fixed a problem you created?" Cedric asked quietly. I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. How many times has she smoothed over an insult you gave? Managed a relationship you damaged? Corrected course after one of your decisions proved short-sighted?" Peter's face flushed. "That's not... She's my wife. She's supposed to support me." "She is supporting you," Cedric said. "She's supporting you so much that you don't even see the work she's doing. You think everything just naturally works out because you're competent. But I'd wager your wife is the reason anything works at all." "That's not true," Peter protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Cedric pulled out a sheet of paper. "I want you to make a list. Every social success you've had since your marriage. Every alliance that went smoothly. Every crisis that resolved itself. Then I want you to ask yourself honestly, did you accomplish those things, or did your wife?" Peter stared at the blank paper like it might bite him. "Here's what I learned too late," Cedric said, his voice rough with something between regret and hard-won wisdom. "Power built on someone else's invisible labor always collapses when they stop carrying you. Always. The only question is whether you learn to value them before they decide you're not worth the effort." "What happened to your wife?" Peter asked quietly. "She left." Cedric met the young man's eyes directly. "And then she systematically destroyed everything I'd built on her foundation. She was so thorough, so brilliant in dismantling my life, that even my enemies were impressed. I lost everything because I never saw her value until it was gone." Peter's hand trembled slightly as he picked up the pen. "You still have time," Cedric said. "You can learn to see your wife before she becomes invisible. You can build genuine partnership instead of exploiting her competence. But you have to choose it every day. And it's harder than you think." Over the following weeks, Cedric met with more young nobles. Each one was a variation on the same theme. Men who'd inherited power and mistaken it for earned authority, who treated partners like assets, who were following the exact path Cedric had walked until it led off a cliff. Some listened. Some dismissed him as a failure whose advice couldn't be trusted. But a few, a precious few, seemed to genuinely hear what he was saying and reconsider their assumptions. Those were the ones that made the degradation almost bearable. 6 months into his new role, Cedric received a message from Lady Vance requesting his presence at a private gathering. He arrived to find a room full of noble women, most of whom he vaguely recognized from court functions years ago. Helena stood at the center, her expression serious. Duke Ravenshade, thank you for coming. I wanted you to meet the women whose experiences inspired our initiative. One by one, they told their stories. Wives who'd built their husbands' careers while remaining invisible. Daughters who'd managed family affairs while brothers took credit. Women whose intelligence and competence had been systematically erased by men who needed to believe they were naturally superior. Every story was a variation of what Eveline had endured. Every woman had reached a breaking point. Several had chosen Eveline's path, strategic withdrawal, and the systematic dismantling of the facades they'd maintained. You're the first man who's been willing to admit what happened to him, one woman said. The first one to own that your wife was the reason you succeeded and that losing her destroyed you. Most men in your position would blame her, another added. Call her manipulative, vindictive. You're calling yourself incompetent instead. Because I was, Cedric said simply. I am. I mistook privilege for talent and another person's work for my own ability. That's not Eveline's fault. It's mine. The women exchanged glances, something passing between them that Cedric couldn't quite interpret. We want to expand the program, Helena said. Create a formal curriculum. Use your experience as the foundation for teaching partnership over exploitation. Are you willing? Cedric looked around the room at these women who'd been where Eveline had been, who'd made similar choices or were still contemplating them. If I can help even one person avoid what I did to my wife, yes, I'm willing. It won't give you your life back, Helena warned. I don't want my old life back, Cedric said, surprising himself with the truth of it, that life was built on lies and borrowed competence. I'd rather build something real, even if it's small. Mom. A year after leaving Ravenshade Manor, Cedric saw Eveline again. She was at a royal function he'd been hired to observe as part of his work documenting partnership dynamics among nobility. He'd been assured she wouldn't be there. The information had been wrong. Eveline stood at the center of a group of influential nobles, wearing midnight blue silk that made her look like concentrated authority. She was laughing at something Lord Marcus had said, her entire bearing radiating the confidence of someone who knew exactly who they were and what they were worth. She was magnificent. Cedric watched from the shadows, making no move to approach, just observing the woman who'd destroyed his life and somehow made it better by forcing him to see the truth. She never looked his direction, never acknowledged his presence. He might as well have been furniture for all the attention she paid him. And that was fine, better than fine. She'd moved so far beyond him that he didn't even register as relevant anymore. As the evening wound down, Cedric prepared to leave. He'd completed his observations, documented the partnership patterns he'd been sent to identify. There was no reason to linger. Duke Ravenshade. The voice stopped him cold. He turned to find Eveline standing 3 feet away, her expression neutral. Lady Eveline, he managed. I heard about your new work, she said, teaching others not to make your mistakes. Yes. Cedric met her eyes, those familiar green eyes that had once looked at him with hope and later with nothing at all. It's humbling. Good. Humility might be the first useful thing you've learned. She studied him with clinical assessment. You look different, poorer, older, wiser maybe. A smile ghosted across her face. 2 out of 3 isn't bad. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Cedric searched for something to say, some way to communicate the enormity of what he'd learned, how completely she'd been right about everything. I'm not going to apologize, he said finally, because no apology would be adequate. But I want you to know that I understand now what you did, why you did it, how completely I deserved all of it. Eveline's expression softened slightly. That's not why I did it, Cedric. I didn't do it because you deserved punishment. I did it because I deserved freedom. I know, he said quietly, and I'm glad you found it. She nodded slowly, and for just a moment, Cedric saw a flash of the woman she'd been when they'd first married, before he'd ground her down, before she'd learned to protect herself. I hope your work helps people, she said, genuinely. The kingdom doesn't need more men like you were. It needs men like you're becoming. Thank you, Cedric said, and meant it with every fragment of his broken pride. Eveline turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Yes? Stop calling yourself Duke. You're just Cedric now. The sooner you accept that, the easier it will be. She walked away, back to her circle of genuine friends and earned respect, leaving Cedric standing alone with the truth. He wasn't a duke anymore. Wasn't a noble power broker or a master strategist. He was just a man who'd lost everything and was trying to build something honest from the wreckage. And somehow, stripped of titles and illusions, that felt more real than anything he'd been before. Cedric left the function and walked through streets where no one recognized him or cared about his name. Returned to his small apartment above the bookshop, sat at his modest desk and began writing notes for his next consultation. This was his life now. Small, honest, built on the foundation of admitted failure rather than stolen success. It would never be impressive, would never command fear or envy, would never make him the kind of man people wrote songs about, but it was real. And it was his. Actually his, earned through the brutal education of complete collapse and the slow, painful work of becoming someone different. Somewhere in the capital, Evelyn was probably at another reception, building another alliance, being exactly who she was always meant to be. And Cedric? Cedric was learning that sometimes the greatest transformation doesn't come from rising to power, but from falling so completely that you have no choice but to rebuild yourself as something better than you were. The choice wasn't whether to change. The collapse had made that decision for him. The only choice left was whether to change into someone honest or disappear into bitterness. He chose honesty. Because Evelyn had taken everything else, and honesty was all he had left. The summons arrived on a morning that tasted like ash and distant thunder. Cedric was reviewing consultation notes when the courier appeared at his door, a young man wearing the royal crest and carrying an envelope sealed with wax the color of dried blood. "Your presence is required at the capital," the courier said without preamble. 3 days hence. The matter is urgent." Cedric took the envelope, his fingers steady despite the sudden acceleration of his pulse. "What matter?" The courier's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Pity, maybe, or the kind of fascinated dread people felt watching someone walk toward their own execution. "I'm not at liberty to say, but you should bring whatever you value most. You may not be returning." After the courier left, Cedric broke the seal with hands that had learned to stay calm through crisis. The letter inside was brief, formal, and utterly devastating. "Cedric Ravenshade, you are hereby summoned to appear before the Crown Council to address charges of defamation and attempted sabotage against Lady Evelyn Marlowe. Evidence has been presented suggesting you've been using your position to undermine her work and spread malicious rumors about the nature of your marriage's dissolution. Failure to appear will result in arrest and formal prosecution. This is your only opportunity to answer these accusations directly. The council convenes at dawn 3 days from receipt of this notice." Cedric read the letter twice, then a third time, his mind working through implications like a man calculating how deep the water is before jumping. Defamation. Sabotage. He'd done neither, had deliberately avoided speaking about Evelyn except in the context of his own failures, had been scrupulously careful to take responsibility for the collapse without ever mentioning her orchestration of it. Someone was lying, and whoever it was had the crown's ear. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a blade being drawn. If someone was trying to destroy what little he'd rebuilt, they'd picked the wrong target. He'd already lost everything once. The second time around, you learned to fight with nothing left to lose. That was the thing about falling all the way to the bottom. The view was clearer from down there, and you stopped fearing the drop. The journey to the capital took 2 days of hard riding through territories that had once welcomed him and now barely registered his passage. Cedric pushed his horse harder than he should have, driven by something that felt less like urgency and more like inevitability. Whatever waited for him in the capital, running from it would accomplish nothing. He arrived at sunset on the second day, the city sprawling before him like a creature made of stone and ambition. Cedric had once navigated these streets with the confidence of someone who belonged at the center of power. Now he moved through them like a ghost visiting the scene of his former life. The inn where he secured lodging was modest, clean, the kind of place where no one asked questions if you paid in advance. The innkeeper gave him a key and directions to the bathhouse without ever meeting his eyes. Anonymity felt strange after years of automatic deference, but Cedric had learned to prefer it. Being nobody meant being underestimated, and that was its own kind of advantage. That night, sleep came in fragments interrupted by dreams of courtrooms and Eveline's face, cold and perfect, and utterly unmoved as she watched him burn. He woke before dawn, dressed in the only formal clothes he still owned, threadbare in places but clean, and made his way through empty streets toward the palace complex. The Crown Council chambers stood at the heart of government, a massive building of white marble and accusations. Guards stopped him at the entrance, checked his summons, and waved him through with the mechanical efficiency of men who'd seen 1,000 nervous souls walk this same path toward judgment. Inside, the corridors smelled like old power and fresh desperation. Cedric followed a clerk through passages lined with portraits of nobles who'd stood where he was about to stand. Some had survived, most hadn't. The council chamber was smaller than he'd expected, more intimate. 12 seats arranged in a semicircle facing a single chair that sat isolated in the center of the room like an island or a target. Members of the Crown Council were already present, their faces familiar from court functions he'd attended in another lifetime. Lord Chancellor Pemberton sat at the center, the same Pemberton whose family had been the first to sever ties after Evelyn's departure. His expression was carved granite. Duke Ravenshade, Pemberton said, and the title sounded like an accusation. Please be seated. Cedric sat in the isolated chair, his spine straight, his hands loose in his lap. He'd learned something valuable over the past year. Dignity wasn't about what you owned, but about how you carried yourself when you owned nothing. You've been summoned to address serious allegations, Pemberton continued. Lady Evelyn Marlowe has brought evidence that you've been actively working to damage her reputation and undermine her position within the diplomatic corps. That's not true, Cedric said quietly. I've done no such thing. Then how do you explain these? A clerk placed documents on the table before Cedric. Letters, reports, detailed accounts of conversations where someone claiming to be Cedric Ravenshade had spread vicious rumors about Eveline's character, her competence, her methods. Cedric read through them with growing horror. Each one was damning. Each one painted him as a vengeful ex-husband using his limited remaining influence to poison Evelyn's hard-won reputation. Each one was also a complete fabrication. I didn't write these, Cedric said. I've never said these things. Someone is using my name, but it isn't me. Convenient, a council member muttered. Where is Lady Evelyn? Cedric asked, his voice hardening. If she's making these accusations, she should be here to make them to my face. Lady Evelyn is addressing a trade summit in the northern provinces, Pemberton said. She provided her testimony in writing, along with witness statements from multiple sources who claim to have heard you making these defamatory remarks. Who? Cedric demanded. Who are these witnesses? Pemberton consulted his notes. Lord Victor Ashton, Lady Margaret Sterling, Duke Harold Thornbury. Thornbury. The name hit Cedric like a fist. The same Thornbury he'd tried to impress at that fateful banquet. The man whose approval had cost Cedric everything. And suddenly, with the clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose, Cedric understood. This isn't about me, he said quietly. This is about destroying what I've been building. You've built nothing, a council member scoffed. Exactly, Cedric said, his mind racing. I've built nothing. I have no power, no influence, no ability to damage Lady Evelyn even if I wanted to, which makes me useless as a target unless someone wants to eliminate the work I've been doing. What work? Pemberton's eyes narrowed. Teaching young nobles to recognize and value their partners. Helping them avoid the mistakes I made. Cedric leaned forward. I've been documenting patterns of exploitation and helping families build genuine partnerships instead of extracting invisible labor from competent women. That's hardly revolutionary, someone said. No, but it's inconvenient for men who've built their entire power base on taking credit for their wives' work. Cedric's voice gained strength. Men like Duke Thornbury, who I'd wager is behind these fabricated letters. That's a serious accusation, Pemberton warned. Is it? Cedric stood, no longer willing to play the role of apologetic supplicant. Thornbury was at that banquet. He encouraged my behavior toward Evelyn because he operates the same way, using his wife's competence while publicly dismissing her. If my work spreads, if more people start recognizing that pattern, men like Thornbury lose their primary source of unearned success. The council members exchanged glances, something shifting in the room's atmosphere. You're suggesting Duke Thornbury fabricated evidence to discredit you? Pemberton's tone was carefully neutral. I'm suggesting that someone with resources and motive created a situation where I'd be silenced before the partnership initiative could gain real traction. Cedric met Pemberton's eyes directly. And I'm suggesting that you investigate who actually benefits from my destruction before you make me the scapegoat. Why should we believe you? Another council member asked. Because I have nothing to gain from lying. Cedric gestured at himself, his worn clothes, his complete lack of ornament or pretense. Look at me. I'm barely surviving on a modest stipend. I have no power, no connections, no ability to hurt Lady Evelyn, even if I harbored that kind of vindictiveness, which I don't. She was right about everything. I've spent a year proving that by teaching others not to be what I was. The silence that followed felt fragile, like glass under pressure. We'll investigate your claims, Pemberton said finally. But until this matter is resolved, you're confined to the capital. Any attempt to leave will be considered an admission of guilt. Cedric nodded. I understand, but I want one thing in return. You're in no position to make demands, a council member snapped. Not a demand, Cedric corrected. A request. Let me face my accusers. If Thornbury or the Ashtons or anyone else claims to have heard me spreading these rumors, I want the chance to confront them directly. Pemberton considered this. That can be arranged. 3 days. We'll convene a formal hearing with all parties present. After they dismissed him, Cedric walked out of the council chambers feeling something he hadn't felt in over a year. The cold clarity of purpose. Someone had tried to destroy him using the exact tactics he'd once employed against others. Manipulation, false narratives, leveraging institutional power for personal advantage. The irony would have been amusing if it wasn't so dangerous. That evening, Cedric sat in a tavern near the Palace District, nursing weak beer and watching nobles come and go with the easy confidence of people who'd never had to question their place in the world. He used to be one of them. Now he was invisible, just another worn-down man in a corner booth. You look like you're contemplating murder or suicide. Cedric looked up to find Marcus Ashford sliding into the seat across from him, 2 fresh beers in hand. I thought you were in Blackmir, Cedric said. I was. Heard about your summons and rode hard to get here. Marcus pushed a beer across the table. Figured you could use someone in your corner who actually knows you're not stupid enough to sabotage Eveline. I'm not sure I deserve that faith. You don't, Marcus agreed cheerfully. But you're also not lying about this. I know Thornbury. I know his methods. This has his fingerprints all over it. Cedric drank, the beer tasting like temporary salvation. Why would he bother? I'm nobody now. You're dangerous, Marcus said, not because of what you have, but because of what you've become. A man who actually admits his failures and teaches others to avoid them? That's terrifying to people whose entire existence depends on nobody questioning the system. So I'm being eliminated. They're trying. Marcus leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Cedric turned his beer glass in slow circles, watching condensation pool on the scarred wood table. I'm going to prove they're lying, and then I'm going to make sure everyone knows why they lied. That's dangerous. Marcus's tone was serious now. Thornbury has resources you don't, allies who'll protect him. You're walking into a fight you can't win. Probably, Cedric agreed, but I've already lost everything once. Turns out the second time around, you stop caring about survival and start caring about what's true. Marcus studied him for a long moment. You really have changed. Had to. The alternative was becoming the kind of bitter remnant who drinks himself to death while blaming everyone else for his failures. Cedric met his old friend's eyes. Evelyn forced me to see what I was. I can't unsee it, and I can't let men like Thornbury keep operating the way I used to operate, even if it destroys you, especially then. Cedric's smile was sharp, dangerous. Because the best way to prove I've changed is to sacrifice the comfort of obscurity to protect the thing I spent 5 years failing to understand. That genuine partnership matters more than individual power. Marcus raised his beer in a small salute. Then I'm with you. Whatever you need. The formal hearing convened 3 days later in a chamber designed for spectacle. News of the confrontation had spread through court circles with the speed of scandal, drawing an audience of nobles who smelled blood and wanted front-row seats. Cedric entered to find the room packed with familiar faces. Some looked curious, others hostile, a few sympathetic. And there, seated in the section reserved for accusers, was Duke Harold Thornberry. The man looked exactly as Cedric remembered, distinguished, confident, radiating the kind of authority that came from never having to question your own righteousness. His wife sat beside him, beautiful and silent, her eyes carrying the same exhausted patience Eveline's had held for years. Lord Chancellor Pemberton called the hearing to order with 3 sharp strikes of a gavel. We are here to determine the truth of allegations made against Cedric Ravenshade. The accused maintains his innocence and has requested the opportunity to face his accusers directly. Duke Thornberry, you provided testimony that you heard Duke Ravenshade spreading defamatory statements about Lady Evelyn Marlowe. Do you stand by that testimony? Thornberry rose with practiced grace. I do. On 3 separate occasions, Duke Ravenshade approached me at social functions and made disparaging remarks about Lady Evelyn's character and competence. He suggested her success was built on manipulation and deceit. Cedric felt rage building in his chest, but kept his expression neutral. When and where did these conversations allegedly occur? Thornberry consulted notes with theatrical precision. The first was at Lord Ashton's winter gala. The second at the royal hunt last spring. The third at— I wasn't at any of those events, Cedric interrupted. I haven't attended a court function in over a year. I wasn't invited. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Pemberton raised a hand for silence. Duke Thornberry, do you have witnesses to these conversations? Lord Victor Ashton was present at the winter gala, Thornberry said smoothly. Victor Ashton stood, a young man Cedric vaguely recognized. He looked nervous, his eyes not quite meeting anyone's directly. Is it true? Pemberton asked. Did you witness this conversation? Victor hesitated, and in that pause, Cedric saw the crack in Thornberry's facade. Answer truthfully, Cedric said quietly. Your integrity is worth more than whatever he's paying you. Victor's face flushed. I heard someone talking about Lady Evelyn, but I didn't actually see who it was. Duke Thornberry told me later that it had been Duke Ravenshade. So you didn't witness the conversation itself, Pemberton said. You were told who said it. Yes, Victor admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. That's hearsay, Marcus called from the audience. Not testimony. Thornberry's expression hardened. Are you calling me a liar? I'm calling you an opportunist, Cedric said, standing. You saw a chance to eliminate someone who threatened your way of operating, and you took it. Just like you encouraged me to humiliate my wife because her competence made you uncomfortable. That's absurd, Thornberry snapped. Is it? Cedric's voice carried to every corner of the chamber. You built your reputation the same way I did, on your wife's invisible work. The difference is, I learned what that cost. You're still extracting labor and taking credit. My work threatens that system, so you tried to destroy me before the pattern became too obvious. You have no proof of these accusations, Thornberry said. Don't I? Cedric turned to address the full chamber. I request permission to call a witness. Pemberton nodded. Proceed. I call Duchess Catherine Thornberry. The chamber erupted in shocked whispers. Thornberry's face went white, then red. That's outrageous, he sputtered. You can't— She's a witness to your character and methods, Cedric said, unless you're afraid of what she might say under oath. Catherine Thornberry rose slowly, every eye in the room fixed on her. She was perhaps 40, elegant in the way of women who'd learned to make themselves small to avoid conflict. She approached the witness chair with the careful steps of someone crossing a frozen lake. Duchess Thornberry, Cedric said gently, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to answer honestly. Who manages your husband's diplomatic relationships? Catherine's hands trembled slightly. I do. Who drafts his trade agreements? I do. Who repairs the damage when his arrogance offends potential allies? I do. Her voice grew stronger with each answer. And does your husband acknowledge this work publicly? Never. Catherine met her husband's eyes across the chamber. He calls me his greatest asset in private and his decorative companion in public, just like Duke Ravenshade used to do with Lady Evelyn. Thornberry stood, his face contorted with rage. This is a setup. You coached her. I've never spoken to your wife before today, Cedric said. I'm simply giving her what I never gave Evelyn, The chance to tell the truth about who actually does the work. Catherine continued, her voice steady now. My husband suggested this scheme to discredit you. He said you were dangerous because you were teaching men to value their wives as partners. He couldn't have that. Too many people might start asking uncomfortable questions about where his success really comes from. The chamber was utterly silent. You betray me with lies? Thornbury's voice shook. After everything I've given you? You've given me nothing but the privilege of carrying you, Catherine said quietly. I'm done. I should have walked away years ago like Lady Evelyn did, but I was too afraid. Watching Cedric face false accusations for telling the truth gave me courage I didn't know I had. Pemberton's gavel struck 3 times. Duke Thornbury, you are hereby charged with perjury and abuse of counsel process. This hearing is adjourned pending full investigation into your conduct. Guards moved toward Thornbury, who stood frozen in disbelief. The man who'd orchestrated Cedric's humiliation was now experiencing his own very public collapse. But Cedric felt no satisfaction, just exhausted recognition that this cycle, men building empires on women's invisible labor, then destroying anyone who threatened to expose that reality, would continue long after this moment, unless someone kept fighting to break it. After the hearing, Cedric found Catherine Thornbury in a small antechamber, still shaking from her testimony. Thank you, he said simply. That took courage I'm not sure I would have had. She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and endured too long. I watched you at that banquet a year ago, watched you humiliate your wife for approval from my husband. I hated you for it. But then I saw what happened after, how you lost everything, how you didn't make excuses or blame her, how you just accepted it and tried to become better. That was survival, not virtue. Maybe, Catherine said, but it was still more than most men in your position would have done. Most would have blamed Lady Evelyn and spent their lives seeking revenge. You blamed yourself and built something honest from the ruins. I had no choice. Evelyn made sure of that. She gave you consequences, Catherine corrected. What you did with them was your choice, and watching you choose accountability over bitterness? That showed me there was another way. What will you do now? Cedric asked. Leave. Start over. Maybe find work with Lady Evelyn's coalition helping other women escape situations like mine. Catherine's smile was fragile but real. Turns out, there's a whole network of us now. Women Lady Evelyn has connected who support each other in building lives outside marriages that were slowly killing us. The image was simultaneously heartbreaking and hopeful. An entire underground network of women escaping the same trap Evelyn had escaped, helping each other survive and thrive outside the system that had used them. She really did change everything, Cedric said quietly. She changed you, Catherine replied. That's something. That evening, Marcus found Cedric in the same tavern, the same corner booth. You won, Marcus said, sliding into the opposite seat. Did I? Cedric gestured around the half-empty room. Thornbury will face consequences, but there are 100 more like him. The system doesn't change just because one man gets caught. No, but you created a crack in the foundation. Catherine testifying publicly? That matters. Other women will see it and realize they can speak too. Maybe. Cedric drank his beer, tasting ash and uncertainty. Or maybe it just makes the survivors more careful about covering their tracks. When did you become so cynical? When I realized that the thing I'm fighting, the assumption that some people's labor and competence should benefit others without recognition, is built into the very structure of how nobility operates. Cedric set down his glass. I spent a year teaching individuals to be better partners, but individual change doesn't fix systemic exploitation. So what do you do? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge or a prayer. I keep fighting anyway, Cedric said finally, because the alternative is accepting that Evelyn's suffering and Catherine's suffering and the suffering of every woman invisibly holding up incompetent men, that all of it is just the price of maintaining social order. I can't accept that. Not anymore. Marcus studied him thoughtfully. You know Evelyn's going to hear about this, about you defending her work and exposing Thornbury's methods. Probably. What do you think she'll do? Nothing, Cedric said. Because she doesn't need to do anything. She's already built the thing that matters, a network of women supporting each other outside the traditional power structures. My fight with Thornberry is just noise compared to that. You don't think she'll be impressed? I think she'll be satisfied that I finally understand what actually matters. Cedric's smile was sad. She spent 5 years trying to teach me that genuine partnership and mutual respect create stronger foundations than exploitation and fear. I'm finally learning the lesson, just several years too late to matter. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at Cedric's modest apartment. The handwriting on the envelope made his breath catch. Eveline's precise, elegant script. He sat at his small desk for 10 minutes before opening it, preparing himself for whatever truth it contained. Cedric, I heard about the hearing, about Catherine's testimony, about your refusal to participate in the system that destroyed us both. I'm not writing to congratulate you or offer forgiveness you haven't asked for. I'm writing because I want you to understand something important. The work you're doing matters, but not for the reasons you might think. You can't fix the system by teaching individual men to be better partners. The exploitation is too deeply embedded, too profitable for those who benefit from it. But you can create examples. You can be visible proof that men who've operated within that system can choose something different. Not redemption. That's too easy. Too clean. But transformation. Honest recognition of harm caused and deliberate choice to stop perpetuating it. That's what I saw at the hearing. Not a hero standing up for justice, but a man who'd been broken by consequences finally understanding what those consequences were trying to teach him. Keep doing the work. Not because it will change everything, but because it changes something. And sometimes, small changes in how power operates create cracks where larger transformations become possible. I won't be part of your life going forward. That bridge burned completely, and we both know it. But I wanted you to know that I see what you're trying to build from the ashes of what you destroyed. And I respect it, even as I maintain my distance. The kingdom needs men who've learned these lessons. Not as leaders, you've proven you're not suited for that role, but as examples of what accountability can look like when ego finally breaks under the weight of truth. Be that example. It's the only legacy worth building from the wreckage of House Ravenshade. Evelyn Cedric read the letter 3 times, each pass stripping away another layer of self-deception until only raw truth remained. Evelyn wasn't forgiving him, wasn't welcoming him back into even the periphery of her life. She was simply acknowledging that he'd finally learned what she'd been trying to teach him all along, that power built on exploiting others always collapses, and the only thing worth building is honest partnership and mutual respect. He'd spent a year trying to atone for destroying their marriage, but atonement was never the point. Transformation was. Becoming someone different enough that the mistakes which destroyed everything became impossible to repeat. Not because he wanted redemption, because he'd finally understood that the old way of operating, taking credit, demanding deference, assuming his position meant he deserved success, was not just wrong, but fundamentally unsustainable. Cedric stood and moved to the window, looking out over a city where thousands of relationships were probably following the same doomed pattern his marriage had followed. Men taking and women giving until the giving broke them and they walked away, leaving confused men wondering why their empires crumbled. He couldn't fix all of it, couldn't even fix most of it, but he could be visible proof that recognizing the pattern and choosing differently was possible, even if it cost everything. Especially if it cost everything. Because men with nothing left to lose could afford to tell the truth in ways that comfortable men never could. That night, Cedric began writing. Not a defense or an explanation, but a detailed account of how he'd built success on Eveline's invisible labor, how he'd mistaken extraction for partnership, how the entire system was designed to make that mistake easy and recognizing it almost impossible. He wrote about Catherine Thornberry and the network of women Evelyn had built, about how many marriages probably operated on the same exploitative foundation, about what it felt like to lose everything and discover that everything you'd lost was never really yours to begin with. He wrote until his hand cramped and dawn light crept through the window. Then he took his manuscript to Lady Helena Vance, the woman who'd given him his second chance. "I want to publish this," he told her. "Make it public. Let everyone see exactly how the system works and what it costs the people who hold it together invisibly." Helena read through the pages, her expression growing more serious with each line. "This will make you a target," she said finally. The men who operate like you used to operate will see you as a threat. They'll try to destroy what little you've rebuilt. I know, Cedric said, but staying silent to protect myself just perpetuates the thing that destroyed my marriage and almost destroyed Catherine Thornberry and has destroyed countless other women whose names we'll never know. Helena set down the manuscript carefully. You understand there's no going back from this? Once you publish, you become the man who exposed the rot at the heart of noble partnerships. Some will see you as brave. Most will see you as a traitor to your class. Good, Cedric said, because my class has been betraying the women who hold it together for generations. It's about time someone with nothing left to lose said it out loud. Helena smiled, sharp and approving. Then let's publish. And let's see how many comfortable men panic when they realize their invisible support systems might not stay invisible much longer. But the manuscript published 3 weeks later, distributed through channels Helena's coalition controlled. Within days, it was being discussed in every noble house across the kingdom. Reactions split along predictable lines. Women read it and saw their own experiences reflected back. Men read it and either recognized themselves uncomfortably or dismissed it as the bitter ramblings of a failed duke seeking attention. But some men, a precious few, read it and began asking uncomfortable questions about their own partnerships. Cedric received letters from both camps. Some thanked him for articulating truths they'd never had language for. Others threatened violence for betraying the natural order of marriage and power. He kept both kinds. Evidence that the work mattered and evidence that it made the right people angry. Marcus visited one evening carrying news from the capital. You've created chaos, he said, something like admiration in his voice. Half the court is debating whether invisible labor is real or just feminine manipulation. The other half is quietly examining their own marriages and looking uncomfortable. And Evelyn? Cedric asked, hating that he still cared about her opinion. She's pleased, apparently. One of her associates told me she said, he finally understands that transformation requires making yourself uncomfortable enough that comfort becomes impossible. Marcus paused. She also said you'd make more impact as an uncomfortable truth-teller than you ever did as a comfortable duke. High praise from someone who orchestrated my complete destruction. Is it, though? Marcus asked. Seems to me she gave you the education you needed. Brutal, yes, but effective. You learned more from losing everything than you would have learned from a lifetime of unearned success. Cedric couldn't argue with that assessment. What happens now? Marcus asked. Now I keep writing. Keep teaching. Keep being uncomfortable proof that men can choose something different than exploitation and extraction. Cedric looked at his old friend directly. Not because it will fix everything, but because silence is complicity, and I've been complicit long enough. That's going to make your life harder. Good. Easy lives taught me nothing except how to be casually cruel. Cedric's smile was sharp. I prefer the hard education of consequences. At least it's honest. 6 months after the manuscript published, Cedric stood before a gathering of young nobles at Lady Vance's invitation. The audience was split roughly evenly between men and women, all of them watching him with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. My name is Cedric Ravenshade, he began. I was born into privilege, inherited a dukedom, and married a woman far more competent than I ever was. For 5 years, I took credit for her work, dismissed her value, and assumed my success was proof of my natural superiority. He paused, letting the admission hang in the air. Then she left. And in less than 3 months, everything I thought I'd built collapsed completely. Because I hadn't built anything. She had. I just stood nearby and accepted applause for her architecture. The room was silent, every person leaning forward slightly. I'm not here to tell you I've redeemed myself, Cedric continued. I'm here to tell you that redemption is a comfortable lie. What I've done is transform. Painfully. Unwillingly. But completely. And the thing that forced that transformation was losing everything and having to look honestly at why. A young man raised his hand. How do we avoid making your mistakes? Cedric met his eyes. You don't assume. You don't take credit for work you didn't do. You don't treat partners like assets. You don't mistake someone else's labor for your own competence. And when they tell you something hurts them, you believe them the first time instead of waiting until they leave. Simple words. But the execution? The execution required constant vigilance against every instinct that said you deserved more credit than you'd earned, more authority than you'd built, more loyalty than you'd offered. The path forward wasn't redemption or forgiveness or restoration of what had been lost. It was choosing every day to be something different than what he'd been, to build honest relationships instead of extractive ones, to value actual partnership instead of performing it. Would it erase what he'd done to Evelyn? Never. Would it prevent other women from experiencing what she'd experienced? Maybe. Sometimes. If enough men chose discomfort over exploitation. That was the thing about transformation. It wasn't a destination, but a direction. A continuous choice to walk away from comfortable cruelty toward uncomfortable honesty. As the gathering dispersed, a young woman approached him. "My husband read your manuscript," she said quietly. "He's been different since. Asking about my work, actually listening when I speak." She met Cedric's eyes. "I don't know if it will last, but thank you for giving him a mirror he couldn't ignore." After she left, Cedric stood alone in the empty hall and felt something close to peace. Not the peace of absolution, but the peace of purpose. Of knowing that the wreckage of his marriage had become the foundation for something that might, eventually, spare others from the same destruction. Evelyn would never forgive him. The kingdom would never forget what he'd been. History would remember him as the failed duke whose wife orchestrated his downfall. But perhaps some future historian would add a footnote. And afterward, having lost everything, he chose to become honest about why. That would have to be enough. Because transformation without redemption was the only path forward for men who destroyed everything through their own arrogance. You couldn't undo the harm. You could only stop perpetuating it and hope that, eventually, your example helped others choose differently. Outside, rain began to fall on the capital, washing streets clean of dust and debris. Cedric stood at the window and watched water reshape the familiar landscape into something new. Somewhere in this city, Evelyn was probably working on another negotiation, building another alliance, being exactly who she'd always been beneath the performance of being his wife. And Cedric? Cedric was learning that the greatest transformation wasn't rising from ruin to power, but falling so completely that rising back to comfort became impossible, and choosing, in that impossibility, to build something honest instead. The rain fell harder, and through it, Cedric could almost imagine a future where partnerships based on mutual respect replaced extraction systems based on invisible labor. Almost. But even almost was worth fighting for when you'd spent your entire life benefiting from the alternative. The real battle wasn't winning back what he'd lost. It was ensuring that what he'd lost, the ability to exploit competent women while calling it partnership, could never be rebuilt. And that fight was only beginning. The letter that changed everything arrived on an autumn morning 2 years after Cedric's manuscript had set the kingdom's noble houses ablaze with uncomfortable questions. He was preparing notes for a consultation when the courier appeared. Not a royal messenger this time, but a young woman wearing the colors of Evelyn's diplomatic corps. She handed him the envelope without ceremony. "Lady Evelyn requests your presence in Blackmir tomorrow. The matter concerns your future and hers." Cedric's hand trembled as he took the letter. After 2 years of deliberate distance, of respecting the boundaries she'd drawn with surgical precision, Evelyn was summoning him. The implications made his chest tight with something between dread and dangerous hope. "Did she say why?" he asked. The courier's expression remained professionally neutral. "She said you'd understand when you arrived, and that you should come alone." After she left, Cedric broke the seal with hands that had learned steadiness through repetition, but forgot it now. The message inside was brief, written in Evelyn's precise script. "Cedric, 2 years ago, I told you we would never be part of each other's lives again. I meant it then. But circumstances have changed in ways neither of us anticipated. There's something you need to see, and it can't be communicated through letters or intermediaries. Come to Blackmir. We'll meet at the Meridian House at sunset tomorrow. Don't be late. This isn't reconciliation, but it is necessary." Cedric read it 3 times, searching for subtext, and finding only the same directness that had characterized every interaction with Evelyn since she'd walked away. She didn't waste words on false warmth or unnecessary explanation. If she said something was necessary, it was. The question was, necessary for what? He left that afternoon, riding through territories that had become familiar over 2 years of teaching and consulting work. The landscape had changed in subtle ways. New construction here, abandoned estates there, the visible evidence of a kingdom slowly reshaping itself as partnerships either strengthened or collapsed under the weight of revealed exploitation. Cedric's manuscript had become required reading in several noble houses, its uncomfortable truths forcing conversations that had been avoided for generations. Not everyone changed, but enough people were asking questions that the old system of invisible labor was becoming harder to maintain without conscious choice. That was something. Small, but real. The ride to Blackmir took 2 days. Cedric spent them turning over possibilities in his mind like stones, searching for sharp edges. Why would Evelyn break 2 years of silence now? What had changed that made his presence necessary rather than simply tolerable? By the time he reached the coastal city, his nerves were stretched thin with anticipation and the particular anxiety that came from approaching someone who'd once known you completely and had chosen, for excellent reasons, to forget you existed. Blackmir looked more prosperous than his last visit. New buildings clustered near the harbor. The streets bustled with merchants from a dozen provinces. The Trade Council building had expanded, its influence growing alongside Evelyn's reputation as the kingdom's most effective diplomatic architect. She'd built an empire here, not through exploitation or inherited privilege, but through genuine competence and the radical concept of treating people like they mattered. The contrast to what Cedric had lost was almost physically painful. He found lodging at the same inn he'd stayed at during his first desperate visit, when he'd still believed there might be a path back to relevance that didn't require complete transformation. The innkeeper recognized him with a nod, but no judgment. Cedric had become enough of a public figure through his published work that anonymity was impossible, but his new reputation preceded him differently than his old title had. People knew him now as the failed duke who'd become honest about his failures. That carried its own strange weight. Sunset approached with the slow inevitability of consequences. Cedric washed, changed into his best clothes, still modest by his old standards, but clean and well-maintained, and walked through Blackmir's streets toward the Meridian House. His heart hammered against his ribs with each step. The last time he'd seen Evelyn had been at that royal function where she'd told him to stop calling himself Duke, to accept that he was just Cedric now. That conversation had been brief, professional, utterly devoid of warmth. He had no reason to expect this one would be different. The Meridian House stood elegant and imposing as he remembered, its windows glowing with lamplight as evening descended. Cedric climbed the steps with the careful movements of a man approaching either salvation or execution and unsure which he preferred. The same clerk from 2 years ago met him at the entrance. His expression suggested he remembered Cedric's last visit and wasn't particularly thrilled about this one. "Lady Evelyn is expecting you. 3rd floor, her private office." The clerk's tone made it clear. "Don't cause problems." Cedric climbed stairs that felt steeper than they should, his breath coming shorter, his palms damp. Every step brought him closer to the woman who dismantled his life with such precision that he'd had no choice but to rebuild himself from nothing. The woman he'd loved poorly and lost completely. The woman who'd proven that sometimes the greatest act of mercy was refusing to forgive someone who didn't deserve it. He reached the 3rd floor and found the door to Evelyn's office slightly ajar, warm light spilling into the corridor. Cedric knocked twice, heard her voice call for him to enter, and stepped across a threshold that felt impossibly significant. Evelyn stood by the window overlooking Blackmir's harbor, backlit by the dying sun so her face was momentarily obscured. Then she turned and Cedric saw her clearly for the first time in 2 years. She looked different. Older in subtle ways, lines around her eyes that spoke of hard-won wisdom, a gravity to her bearing that came from carrying real responsibility instead of just managing someone else's ego. She wore deep burgundy, her hair swept back in a style that was both elegant and practical. She looked like exactly who she'd always been underneath the performance of being his wife. Formidable, brilliant, entirely self-possessed. "Cedric," she said. Her voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "Thank you for coming." He remained near the door, uncertain of the protocol for facing someone you'd destroyed who'd then destroyed you right back. "You said it was necessary." "It is." Evelyn moved to her desk, gestured for him to sit in the chair across from it. "But perhaps not in the way you're expecting." Cedric sat, his hands loose in his lap, every muscle in his body tense with the effort of appearing calm. "Whatever you need to say, I'm listening." Evelyn studied him for a long moment. her green eyes searching his face with the same clinical assessment she'd always brought to complex problems. You look different, less haunted than the last time I saw you. I've learned to live with what I did. Not forgive myself, that would be too easy. But accept it and try to build something that makes the destruction slightly less pointless. Your manuscript caused quite a stir. That was the intention. Some people think you wrote it seeking redemption. Evelyn's tone remained carefully neutral. Those people don't understand the difference between redemption and accountability, Cedric said. I wrote it because silence would have been complicity in a system that almost destroyed you and has destroyed countless other women. I couldn't live with that silence, even though speaking cost you what little comfort you'd rebuilt, especially because of that. Cedric met her eyes directly. Comfortable lies taught me nothing except how to be casually cruel. Uncomfortable truth is the only education worth having. Evelyn's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been approval or might have been simple acknowledgement. You really have changed. I had to. The alternative was dying slowly while blaming everyone else for my failures. Cedric allowed himself a small, bitter smile. You made sure of that when you pulled every support structure out from under me simultaneously. Did you hate me for it? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with 2 years of distance and everything that had come before. At first, yes, Cedric admitted. When I discovered you'd orchestrated the collapse, I felt betrayed, angry, self-righteous in my victimhood. But that lasted maybe a week before I realized you'd only been able to destroy me because there was nothing real holding my empire together. You didn't betray me, Evelyn. You just stopped protecting me from myself. Evelyn nodded slowly. I'm glad you understand that. It makes what I'm about to tell you easier. She pulled documents from a drawer, spread them across the desk between them. Cedric recognized legal papers, official seals, the formal language of binding contracts. What is this? He asked. The reason I summoned you. Evelyn's expression was unreadable. Over the past 2 years, your work has had significant impact. The partnership initiative you've been running with Lady Vance has helped dozens of couples build genuine mutual respect instead of exploitative arrangements. Your manuscript has become required reading in reform-minded houses. You've essentially created a blueprint for recognizing and dismantling the invisible labor system. Cedric waited, sensing there was a larger point approaching. The Crown has noticed, Evelyn continued. They're proposing a formal position, Royal Advisor on Partnership Equity. You'd have resources, authority, the ability to implement structural changes instead of just teaching individual couples. It's a chance to transform the system instead of just helping people navigate it. The words should have felt like vindication. Instead, they felt like a trap whose mechanism he couldn't quite identify. Why are you telling me this? Why not let them approach me directly? Because I'm the one who recommended you for the position. Evelyn's voice was steady, but something flickered in her eyes. And because accepting it means working closely with the diplomatic corps, which means working with me. Cedric's breath caught. You want me to refuse? No. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. I want you to understand what you'd be accepting. We'd be colleagues, Cedric, not friends. That ship burned and sank 2 years ago, but professional partners working toward the same goal from different angles. I'd handle diplomatic negotiations and international partnerships. You'd handle domestic reform and education on partnership equity. And you're comfortable with that? After everything? Comfortable isn't the word I'd use. Evelyn's smile was sharp. But I'm capable of it. The question is whether you are. Can you work alongside the woman whose marriage you destroyed without either seeking forgiveness, I won't give, or harboring resentment over consequences you earned? Cedric processed the question carefully. This wasn't an olive branch. It was a professional assessment of whether he could function in proximity to his own failure without making it everyone else's problem. I think so, he said slowly. I've spent 2 years learning to carry what I did without letting it paralyze me. Working with you would be uncomfortable, but discomfort seems to be where I do my best work now. Discomfort is where transformation happens, Evelyn agreed. Comfort breeds complacency. You learned that the hard way. So did you, Cedric observed quietly. You were comfortable in our marriage for years before you started planning your exit. Evelyn's expression hardened slightly. I was never comfortable. I was surviving. There's a difference. You're right. I'm sorry. Cedric felt the familiar shame rise and forced himself to sit with it instead of deflecting. I spent 5 years mistaking your survival mechanisms for contentment. That was one of many things I got catastrophically wrong. The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. Just two people acknowledging a shared history that had left scars on both of them. If I accept this position, Cedric said carefully, what are the boundaries? How do we work together without the past poisoning everything? Evelyn pulled out another document, this one covered in her handwriting. I've drafted protocols. We communicate through official channels unless absolute privacy is necessary. We attend the same meetings but maintain professional distance. We never discuss our marriage or personal history in professional contexts. And if either of us becomes unable to maintain that separation, we bring in mediators immediately rather than letting it fester. You've thought this through thoroughly.
I've thought everything through thoroughly since the day I decided to leave you. Evelyn's voice carried an edge. That's how I survived being married to a man who never thought past his own immediate advantage. The accusation stung because it was true. Cedric had spent their entire marriage reacting to circumstances instead of anticipating them, relying on Evelyn to handle strategy while he performed authority.
Fair enough, he said. And if I accept, what happens to the work I'm already doing with Lady Vance? It expands. You'd have a team, resources, the ability to implement your ideas at scale instead of one consultation at a time. Evelyn's expression softened slightly. Your manuscript was powerful, Cedric, but it reached primarily people already questioning the system. This position would give you access to people who need to be pushed toward those questions. And you believe I'm capable of that? I believe you're the only person positioned to do it effectively. Evelyn's honesty was brutal and somehow comforting. You're a failed duke who admitted his failures publicly and built something meaningful from the wreckage. That gives you credibility with both reformers and traditionalists that no one else can claim. Because I'm living proof that the old system destroys even the people who benefit from it. Exactly. You're a cautionary tale and a transformation story simultaneously. That's rare and valuable. Cedric studied the document spread across the desk, the formal offer of something he'd never imagined possible. A chance to matter again, not through inherited privilege or stolen credit, but through honest work addressing real problems. The catch was working alongside the woman he'd failed so completely that she'd had to orchestrate his destruction to escape him. Can I ask you something personal? Cedric said quietly. Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. One question. Do you still hate me? Evelyn was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. Hate requires emotional investment. I no longer have in you. What I feel is complicated. Sadness at what could have been if you'd been capable of partnership. Relief that I escaped before your gravity destroyed me completely. Respect for what you've built from the ruins, even as I maintain firm boundaries around my own life. She met his eyes directly. You were the worst thing that happened to me for 5 years, Cedric. But you were also the catalyst that forced me to become who I am now. I don't hate you. I just don't trust you with anything personal, and I never will again. The honesty was devastating and exactly what Cedric needed to hear. That's fair, he said. More than fair, actually. And I want you to know, not as a bid for forgiveness, but as a statement of fact, that I understand the harm I caused was permanent. I don't expect trust or warmth or anything beyond professional respect. But I will spend the rest of my life ensuring that what happened to you happens to fewer women going forward. Evelyn studied him carefully. Why? Because it's the only thing that makes the destruction of our marriage mean something beyond just my personal failure. Cedric's voice roughened. If my catastrophic incompetence as a partner can become the foundation for systemic change, then at least the pain wasn't entirely pointless. That's a heavy burden to carry. I've been carrying it for 2 years. It's gotten easier with practice. Evelyn gathered the documents, aligned them with precise movements. Take 3 days to consider the offer. Discuss it with people you trust. Make sure you understand what you'd be accepting, not just the position, but the reality of working with me indefinitely. And if I accept, then we become the strangest partnership in the kingdom's diplomatic history. Evelyn's smile was sharp. The brilliant strategist and the reformed failure, rebuilding marriage and partnership norms from opposite ends of personal experience. Sounds appropriately uncomfortable, Cedric said. Discomfort is where transformation happens, Evelyn repeated. You taught me that, actually, though not in the way you intended. Cedric spent the next 3 days walking Blackmir streets, sitting in quiet corners of taverns, turning the offer over in his mind from every angle. Marcus arrived on the second day, summoned by a letter Cedric had sent asking for counsel. They sat in a cafe overlooking the harbor, afternoon light painting everything gold and deceptive. "You're actually considering this," Marcus said, "working with the woman who destroyed you." "She didn't destroy me. She stopped holding me together." Cedric watched fishing boats navigate the harbor entrance, their movements careful and practiced. "There's a difference." Semantics. No. Truth. Cedric turned to face his old friend. "I destroyed myself through 5 years of systematic neglect and casual cruelty. Eveline just made sure I experienced the natural consequences instead of being protected from them." Marcus drank his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "And now she wants you as a colleague. She wants someone who understands the system from the inside because they were complicit in it. Someone who can speak to men who operate like I operated and actually be heard." Cedric leaned back in his chair. "I'm not the best person for this work because I'm redeemed. I'm the best person because I'm honest about how thoroughly I failed. That's a bleak way to view your qualifications." "It's an honest way." Cedric's smile was tired. "And honesty is the only commodity I have left to trade on." "Do you still love her?" The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through every careful rationalization Cedric had constructed. "I don't know if I ever really loved her," he admitted. "I loved the idea of her. The elegant wife who made me look good. The competent partner who fixed my problems. The beautiful woman who enhanced my status. But I never loved Eveline as a person, never valued her internal world or her dreams, or her right to a life that wasn't entirely about supporting mine." "That's not an answer." "It is, though." Cedric met Marcus's eyes directly. "Because whatever I feel now, regret, respect, this aching recognition of what I lost, it's still fundamentally about me, my growth, my transformation, my comfort or discomfort. Until I can think about Eveline without making it about my own emotional journey, I don't have the right to call anything I feel for her love." Marcus whistled low. "You really have learned some things." "I've learned that love requires seeing someone clearly and valuing them anyway. I never saw Eveline clearly until she was gone. So no, I don't love her. I respect her enormously. But respect from a distance is the only thing I can offer that doesn't make her responsible for managing my feelings again." The conversation shifted to logistics after that, to practical considerations and strategic thinking. But the question stayed with Cedric long after Marcus left, heavy and unanswerable. Did he love Eveline? Or did he love the painful clarity she'd forced him to develop? Did he want partnership with her, or did he want the validation of her forgiveness? He suspected the answer was the latter, which meant accepting this position would require the same thing his entire transformation had required: choosing discomfort over self-deception, honesty over emotional satisfaction. On the third day, Cedric returned to the Meridian House and found Eveline in the same office, reviewing trade agreements with the focused intensity he remembered from their marriage. "I'll accept the position," he said without preamble, "with the understanding that my personal feelings are irrelevant to our professional partnership and that you set all boundaries regarding our interaction." Eveline set down her documents, her expression carefully neutral. "What personal feelings?" "Complicated ones I have no right to burden you with." Cedric remained standing near the door. "Respect, certainly. Regret, always. And something else I'm not going to name because naming it would make it your problem to manage. And I'm done making my emotional landscape your responsibility." Eveline studied him for a long moment. "That's probably the most mature thing you've ever said to me. Low bar to clear." "True." She stood, moved around the desk, extended her hand formally. "Welcome to the diplomatic course, Cedric. I look forward to a productive and professionally distant working relationship." Cedric shook her hand, feeling the familiar shape of her fingers and the unfamiliar formality of the gesture. "Thank you for the opportunity to do work that matters." "Thank me by doing it well." Eveline released his hand, stepped back to a comfortable distance. "We start next month. There's a partnership summit in the capital where you'll be formally introduced. Until then, familiarize yourself with the existing reform proposals and prepare to defend them against people who'll see you as a traitor to your class. I've been getting practice with that for 2 years. This will be worse. You'll be implementing actual policy, not just teaching willing students.
Evelyn's smile was sharp. Some very powerful men are going to hate you for threatening their comfortable arrangements.
Good. Let them hate me.
Cedric felt something settle in his chest, a kind of grim determination. I've been hated before. I survived.
The partnership summit convened 6 weeks later in the capital's Grand Council chamber, drawing representatives from every major noble house and several minor ones. The room hummed with tension and curiosity. Everyone knew about Cedric's manuscript, about his transformation from failed duke to reform advocate, but few had expected the crown to formalize his work into actual policy. Cedric stood at the front of the chamber beside Evelyn, Lord Chancellor Pemberton, and several other senior officials. The contrast was stark. Evelyn in her diplomatic finery, radiating authority earned through demonstrated competence. Cedric in modest formal wear, his presence an uncomfortable reminder of what happened when that competence went unrecognized. Pemberton called the session to order with 3 strikes of his gavel. We are here to discuss the Partnership Equity Initiative, a comprehensive reform package designed to address systemic exploitation within noble marriages and working relationships. Royal Advisor Cedric Ravenshade will present the core proposals. Cedric stepped forward, acutely aware of hundreds of eyes assessing him. Some sympathetic, many hostile, all curious about what the failed duke would say when given authority again.
2 years ago, he began, his voice steady, I published a manuscript detailing how I built an empire on my wife's invisible labor while taking full credit for her work. Some of you read it and saw yourselves. Some dismissed it as the bitter complaints of a man who couldn't handle consequences. Both reactions were telling. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Cedric let them settle before continuing.
The Partnership Equity Initiative isn't about punishing men for past behavior. It's about creating structures that make exploitation visible and therefore harder to sustain unconsciously. The proposals are simple: mandatory acknowledgement of collaborative work in official documents, formal penalties for taking sole credit for partnerships, required education on recognizing invisible labor, and independent review processes for marriages or partnerships where one party claims systematic exploitation. A noble from the back shouted, "You want to police marriages now? Dictate how husbands and wives interact?" "I want to stop calling extraction partnership," Cedric said clearly. "I want to make it harder for men to do what I did. Build success on someone else's work while genuinely believing they earned it alone. If that feels like policing, perhaps examine why transparency threatens you." The chamber erupted in arguments, some supporting the reforms, others denouncing them as overreach. Cedric stood calmly at the center of the storm, having learned that truth didn't require volume, just persistence.